Tonight we are going to think slowly and gently about power, and about a government that was meant to protect a whole hidden world. When we imagine the story of the Wizarding War, we usually picture a single dark figure, a man of red eyes and cruelty, and we call him the villain and let the matter rest. Yet there is a quieter question worth turning over softly in the mind as sleep begins to gather. The question of whether the Ministry of Magic, with all its marble corridors and folded paper memos, did as much harm in its own careful way. It denied the truth when the truth was frightening. It sent an innocent man to a cold prison for 12 long years without ever holding a trial. It let creatures of despair guard its people. It silenced a wise old teacher. And it once carved cruelty into the hands of children while smiling. And in the end, it fell so quietly into the hands of darkness that many hardly noticed the change. Over the next 20 chapters, we will drift through all of it, unhurried and calm, laying each piece down like a smooth stone in still water. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing you must hold on to. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders grow heavy, and let this old and thoughtful story carry you gently down towards sleep. Somewhere beneath the ordinary streets of London, far below the noise of buses and the hurry of the Muggle world above, there sits a government that most of that world will never see. And it is there that our slow and quiet story begins. The Ministry of Magic is not a castle and not a crown, but an institution, a vast arrangement of offices and rules and quiet decisions made to watch over the whole hidden world of Wizarding Britain. It exists to protect, to shelter, to keep the great secret of magic safe from those who were never meant to know of it. And in its earliest intention there is nothing cruel at all, only the gentle wish of a frightened people to keep themselves from harm. You may picture it, if it helps you drift, as a thing that grew rather than a thing that was built, the way a forest grows without any single hand shaping every branch. It answers to no king that the wizards can see, no visible throne, no monarch walking its corridors in a golden robe. Instead, it answers to itself, to its own long habits, to the accumulated weight of everything it has ever done before, and at its head there sits a minister for magic. One person given an authority that stretches quietly into every wizarding home in the land. That is a great deal of power to place in one office, and it is worth remembering, as your breathing slows and the room grows soft around you, that an office is not the same as a person, and that power poured into a shape can be poured toward any end at all. For here is the first gentle truth of the whole matter, the thought we will return to again and again like a tide, coming back to the same patient shore. The ministry, from the very beginning, is not a heart and not a conscience, but a machine. And a machine does not love or hate the way a living creature does. It hums along, it processes, it stamps and files and decides, and it will run just as smoothly toward kindness as toward cruelty. For it has no feeling of its own to tell the difference. A hammer does not care whether it builds a cradle or breaks a window. A river does not choose whether to water a field or to drown one. And so the ministry, this enormous engine of governance, waits in a kind of moral stillness to be pointed somewhere by the hands that hold it. And the whole of our story is really the slow tale of where those hands chose to point. Understand, too, that the men and women who first raised this institution meant well by it, or meant well enough. They had lived through ages when wizards were hunted, when the fear of the Muggle world could end a magical life in fire and rope, when a careless spell in the wrong meadow might undo a whole village of hidden folk. Out of that fear they longed for order, for a settled way of keeping everyone safe, for someone to draw the boundaries and mind the borders between the two worlds so that no wizard need lie awake in terror of discovery. The statute that hides magic away, the careful separation of the seen and the unseen, all of it grew from a wish that was tender at its root, the wish simply to survive, and there is nothing to condemn in that wish alone. But wishes have a way of hardening into structures, and structures have a way of forgetting the softness that first shaped them. The longing to be safe became a longing to be in control, and the longing to be in control became a habit of controlling. And after enough long and unremembered years, the institution came to serve its own continuance more than it served the people it was raised to shelter. This is the way of so many great and old things, that they begin as an answer to a fear and end as a thing that must be fed, and no single generation ever quite notices the change, because the change comes so slowly, one small comfortable decision at a time, that it never once looks like a betrayal. Consider how vast the thing became, and let the sheer size of it settle over you like a heavy and pleasant blanket. Under the minister there spread out whole departments, each its own little country of parchment and purpose. There was the department that made and enforced the laws, and the department that guarded the deepest and strangest mysteries of magic, and the department that watched over creatures both gentle and dangerous, and even a whole department given over to games and sport, because a hidden people still longs to play. Each of these was led by its own officials, staffed by its own tired and dutiful clerks, filled with its own corridors and its own private customs. And each was a small kingdom in itself, half unaware of what the others were doing on the far side of the same enormous body. And that, dear listener, is the second quiet truth to carry with you towards sleep. When a thing grows so large that no one person can see the whole of it, then no one person is ever quite to blame for what the whole of it does. Power runs downward through the corridors, from the minister to the heads of departments, from the heads to their deputies, from the deputies to the clerks who actually stamp the forms. And by the time a decision has traveled all that distance, it belongs to everyone a little and to no one entirely. The clerk says he only followed the rule. The deputy says she only passed along the order. The department head says he only did what the office required. And so a cruelty can happen with 1,000 hands upon it, and not one of those hands feeling the weight, because the weight has been spread so thin across so many that it seems to press on nobody at all. Everywhere within this great slow body, the small enchantments of ordinary governance drift about, and there is something almost soothing in the picture of them. So let it lull you. Memos folded into little paper birds flutter from office to office of their own accord, carrying instructions and requests down long halls paneled in dark polished wood. Fireplaces flare green as officials step through from one hearth to another. The lifts rattle up and down through the deep, and the enchanted windows show whatever weather the caretakers have chosen for the day. Sunshine or drizzle summoned to order, because even the sky in that place is a matter of policy. It all looks tidy and harmless, and most of the time it is. And that ordinariness is exactly the point. For a machine that does terrible things need not look terrible while it does them. So we begin not with a villain, but with a shape, not with a wicked face, but with an institution that has no single face at all. And we hold in our minds the mild and patient question that the whole story will circle. The question of whether a government can do as much harm through its habits and its blindness and its pride as any dark wizard ever did through hatred. We are not asking yet whether the ministry was evil, for that is a hard word and this is a soft hour. We are only noticing that it was powerful, and that it was vast, and that it was a machine, and that a machine will go wherever it is turned, and that the people who turn it do not always know, or wish to know, where they are turning it at all. Rest with that thought a little while. The thought of the great quiet engine humming away beneath the city, meaning well and doing harm, sheltering and controlling, protecting and forgetting, all at once and all without a single heart to feel the contradiction. In the chapters ahead, we will walk down into its corridors and meet the people who ran it. But for now, it is enough to know the shape of the thing itself, the vast and gentle and dangerous machine, and to let its slow humming carry you softly towards sleep. Let us go down now, gently and without hurry, into the inside of that great machine, into the corridors and the offices and the deep enchanted levels where the real work of the ministry is done. Imagine an atrium of dark and gleaming wood, its floor polished until it shines like still water, its walls the deep color of old chestnut, and a golden fountain rising in the middle, where figures of wizard and witch and creature pour water into a shining pool. All around, the wizarding officials come and go through the fireplaces, brushing soot from their robes, hurrying to lifts that carry them down into the many floors of the deep, and the whole vast space breathes with the low, steady murmur of a place that never truly sleeps. It is beautiful in its way, and it is meant to be, for power likes to dress itself in beauty so that we forget to look too closely at what lies beneath. Beneath the minister, as we began to see, the whole body of the government is divided into departments, and it will soothe you to walk through them slowly, one by one, the way one might count soft, familiar things in the dark. There is the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the largest and the sternest of them all, home to the enforcers of the law and the hunters of dark wizards and the keepers of the great books of rules. There is the Department of Mysteries, sunk deepest of all, where unspeakable subjects are studied behind doors that most officials never dare to open. The nature of thought, of time, of death, of love itself, held in a hush so complete that even the ministry half forgets it is there. There is the department that watches over magical creatures, drawing its careful lines around what may be tamed and what must be feared. And there is even a whole department devoted to games and sport, to broomstick racing and the great tournaments, because a governed people is still a people and still longs to cheer. Each of these is a small kingdom, and each keeps its own hours and its own habits and its own quiet pride. The clerks of one floor may pass their whole working lives without ever truly understanding what is done 3 floors below them, and the more secret the work, the deeper it is buried, so that the strangest and most dangerous knowledge lies at the very bottom, farthest from the light of the atrium and the eyes of the ordinary. Power in this place flows downward and never quite flows back up, so that the ones at the top give the shape of a wish and the ones at the bottom carry it out, and neither end ever fully sees the other. And so the structure itself, simply by being so vast and so divided, becomes a kind of hiding place, a labyrinth in which responsibility can wander until it is lost. Everywhere among these floors, the little enchantments drift, and there is something almost tender in them. So let them settle over you as you breathe. The interdepartmental memos, no longer the great scrolls of older centuries, are folded now into pale violet paper aeroplanes that soar of their own accord from office to office, banking softly around corners, waiting in patient stacks upon desks. The lifts rattle down through the levels with a grill that clatters shut and a cool voice announcing each floor as the golden arrows spin. The memos and the lifts and the cool announcing voice all give the place a rhythm, a steady and comforting order, as though nothing could ever go truly wrong in a world so neatly filed and so carefully stamped. That is the great and gentle deception of bureaucracy, that its tidiness looks like goodness, that a thing so orderly could surely never be cruel. But watch the parchment for a moment longer and see what real power actually looks like inside such a place, for it is rarely loud and almost never dramatic. Power here is a stamp pressed onto a form. Power is a signature at the bottom of an order that no one will read twice. Power is a memo that flies from a high office to a low one and sets 100 small hands moving without a single one of them asking why. There are no thunderbolts in this kind of authority, no cackling and no green fire, only the quiet certainty of the correct procedure correctly followed, and that quietness is exactly what makes it so easy to misuse. A curse must be cast by someone who chose to cast it, and that someone knows what they have done. But an unjust rule may be enforced by 1,000 people who each believe they merely did their ordinary work, and not one of them ever feels the moment where a life was ruined, because the ruin was divided into so many small correct steps that it vanished among them. This is worth resting on, softly, as the room grows dim, because it is the beating secret at the center of the whole tale. The ministry does not usually harm anyone the way a villain harms in a single terrible visible act. It harms in the way that a slow current wears away a bank, one grain of sand at a time, no single grain guilty, the whole slow washing away belonging to no one. A form is misfiled. A case is not reviewed. A warning is set aside for a busier day that never comes. Each small omission is forgivable on its own, and that is precisely how a great injustice is assembled out of 1,000 forgivable pieces, until at last a person is broken by a government that could honestly say no one person ever meant to break them. And so the very virtues of the structure become its dangers. Its size, which was meant to make it strong, makes it blind, for no eye can see the whole of it at once. Its division into departments, which was meant to make it orderly, makes it deaf, for each part hears only itself. Its love of procedure, which was meant to make it fair, makes it slow to notice its own mistakes. For a thing done by the proper procedure feels finished and settled and past questioning, even when it was wrong from the very first stamp. The ministry is not a monster hiding in the deep. It is something stranger and quieter than a monster. It is a vast and patient system that will carry out whatever it is given, kind or cruel, and never once feel the difference in its own bones. Picture, then, the whole of it at rest at the end of a working day, and let the picture carry you toward your own rest. The lifts fall silent. The violet aeroplanes settle onto the desks and cease their soaring. The green fires in the hearths burn low and go dark. The polished floor of the atrium holds the last light of the fountain, and the golden figures pour their endless water into the pool, with a sound like a small stream in a wood at night. Level upon level lies quiet in the deep earth, each department sleeping in its own separate silence. The law above the mysteries above the dark, all of it stacked and stamped and orderly and still. It looks, in that hush, like nothing but a well-kept house, a place of dutiful people who file their papers and go home to their families and mean no one any harm. And most of them do mean no harm, and that is the truest and softest thing of all. The danger of this place was never that it was full of wicked people. The danger was always that it was full of ordinary ones, working inside a shape so large and so divided that ordinary weakness and ordinary blindness and ordinary comfort could add up, quietly and without malice, into something that would one day open every door to the very darkness it was built to keep out. But that is a story for the chapters still to come, and for now it is enough to have walked the corridors and seen the shape of power, and to let the machine settle softly into the dark of the deep earth as you settle softly towards sleep. Far away now from the polished corridors of London, Far out beyond the last green edge of the land, there rises from a cold gray northern sea a fortress of black stone, and it is there that the gentle machine of the ministry keeps the ones it has decided to condemn. The place is called Azkaban, and even the sound of the name has something bleak and heavy in it, like the slow toll of a bell across dark water. It stands upon a small island in the middle of the sea, a triangular tower of ancient stone, battered by wind and salt and the endless motion of the waves, so far from any shore that no ordinary swimmer could ever hope to reach it, so remote that the world may nearly forget it is there at all. And that forgetting, dear listener, is a part of its purpose, for a prison out of sight is a prison out of mind, and a government that cannot see its own cruelty finds that cruelty very easy to keep. Let us not fear the place tonight, for we come to it only as gentle observers, wrapped warm and safe and far away, watching from a great and comfortable distance. Picture the tower rising sheer from the water, its walls slick and dark, its narrow windows like closed eyes, the gray sky pressing low above it, and the gray sea heaving below, so that the whole island seems caught between two colorless expanses with no warmth anywhere between them. Long ago, in years so distant that few now remember the beginning of it, the fortress was raised to hold the very worst of the wizarding world, the darkest and most dangerous, the ones whose crimes were thought too terrible to leave among ordinary folk. In that first intention there is a kind of sense, even a kind of mercy, for every society must do something with those who would harm the rest, and to gather them apart in one guarded place is not in itself a wicked thought. But here is the quiet trouble at the root of Azkaban, and it is worth resting on softly. The ministry did not, in all its long years of power, ever truly ask whether the place should remain as terrible as it had always been. It inherited the fortress the way one inherits an old and fearsome house, and rather than wonder whether the house might be made less cruel, it simply chose to keep it exactly as it was. Generation after generation of ministers came and went in their fine offices, and each one left Azkaban untouched, unquestioned, unreformed, as though its horror were a law of nature rather than a decision that people made and kept on making. And that is the thing to notice, the small and dreadful thing, that the cruelty of Azkaban was never an accident of the past, but a choice renewed in the present, every single year that no one chose to change it. For the fortress was built, in the deepest sense, not out of stone alone, but out of fear itself, and its foundations were laid in despair. The stone walls are only the outer shell of it. The true prison is something colder, a heaviness that settles on the mind and the heart of anyone kept there, a slow draining away of hope until nothing warm is left. The ministry knew this. It was not hidden from the officials who signed the orders and reviewed the sentences and drew up the tidy lists of prisoners. They knew that to send a person to Azkaban was to send them not merely away, but down, into a darkness that would strip them piece by piece of everything that made life worth the living, and they decided, calmly and repeatedly, that this was an acceptable price to pay for order. They decided that the suffering of the condemned was simply the cost of keeping everyone else safe, and they told themselves, no doubt, that the condemned had earned it, and they filed the papers and went home. This is the way institutions come to accept unbearable things, and it is worth understanding gently, for it explains so much of the whole story. No single official ever stood upon that island and looked into the eyes of a wasting prisoner and said that this was good. The horror was never faced so directly. Instead, it lived at a distance, at the far end of a chain of memos and forms and stamps, out beyond the gray sea, where no comfortable clerk would ever have to see it. The fortress could be spoken of in the calm language of policy, as a necessary measure, as a deterrent, as the proper place for dangerous persons. and all that calm language wrapped the real thing so thickly that its true nature could no longer be felt. It is easy to be cruel from a distance. It is easy to sign away a life when the life is only a name upon a list, and the suffering happens somewhere you will never have to stand. And so the ministry made of itself a government that could tolerate despair as a tool. And once a government has learned to do that, it has crossed a quiet line that is very hard to cross back over. For if despair is acceptable when used upon the worst, then the only question that remains is how the worst are chosen. And that question is answered by the same vast and fallible and sometimes hasty machine we have already come to know. The fortress does not decide who enters it. People decide. Officials decide. And those officials are as prone to error and to fear and to certainty as any of us. And yet the sentence they hand down is not a sentence to mere confinement, but a sentence to the slow undoing of the soul. A mistake in an ordinary court might cost a person some years of freedom. A mistake that sends a person to Azkaban costs them something far deeper, and the ministry never seemed to weigh that difference as heavily as it should. Let the picture soften now, and let it carry you toward sleep, but do not lose the thread of it. Think of the fortress standing through the long centuries, unchanged, unquestioned, its lights few and cold, its foundations of fear renewed by every year of silence. Think of how easily a great and busy government can leave such a place alone. How the very smallness of Azkaban, upon the vast map of the ministry's concerns, makes it simple to overlook, a single grim island among 1,000 pressing matters, never quite important enough to reform, never quite troubling enough to face. This is not the cruelty of a monster who delights in pain. It is the cruelty of neglect, of comfortable distance, of a machine that keeps doing a terrible thing simply because it has always done it, and no one with the power to stop has ever cared enough to try. We will come, in the chapters ahead, to the ones who suffered inside those walls, to the innocent held there among the guilty, to the 12 long years that one man endured within that cold. But tonight, it is enough to know the place itself, to understand its foundations, to see clearly and calmly how a government meant to protect its people came to keep a fortress of despair, and to defend it not with malice, but with mere unbroken habit. That is a heavier truth than any single villain, that ordinary neglect can raise and maintain a horror that no ordinary person would ever have chosen to build fresh. So let the gray sea heave slow and endless around the black island, and let the wind move over the water in the dark, and let the fortress stand as it has always stood, remote and forgotten and terrible, while you lie warm and safe and far away from all of it. The cold of Azkaban cannot reach you here. It is only a story now, only an old wrong being told softly in the dark, and the telling of it asks nothing of you but that you understand, and then let it settle, and then let it go, and drift gently down toward the warmth of your own quiet sleep. Now we must speak, softly and without alarm, of the ones who kept that cold fortress, for the walls of Azkaban were never guarded by ordinary jailers with keys and lanterns walking the halls. The keepers were the Dementors, and of all the strange and terrible things in the hidden world, there is perhaps nothing so bleak as they are. They are not truly alive in the way that a person or a beast is alive, and they are not truly dead either, but something between. A kind of hooded emptiness that glides rather than walks, tall and cloaked and faceless, their forms hidden beneath dark tattered robes that hang about them like decay. Where they pass, the air grows cold, and a thin mist rises, and the light seems to fail, and the whole world dims a little, as though something has quietly drunk the warmth out of it. let us understand what they do, gently, from our safe and distant place, so that we may see clearly what the ministry chose when it chose them. A Dementor feeds not upon the body, but upon the mind and the heart, upon every happy memory a person owns, drawing out joy and hope and peace the way a cold drought draws the heat from a room, until nothing warm is left inside at all. To be near one for a moment is to feel the last good thing you can remember begin to fade, to feel a chill settle where your comfort used to be, to feel the light of your own life dim toward gray, and to be kept among them day after day and year after year is to have every gentle thing slowly and steadily taken away, until the mind holds nothing but its worst hours, replayed over and over in a darkness that never lifts. That is what the prisoners of Azkaban endured, not the mere loss of freedom, but the patient theft of every warmth they had ever known. Here, then, is the thing to rest upon tonight, the quiet and heavy fact at the center of this chapter. The ministry did not create these creatures. The Dementors were not made in its offices or bred by its order. They were already there in the world, ancient and dark and utterly without mercy. And the ministry, faced with the difficult task of guarding its prison, made a bargain with them. It employed them. It handed over the keeping of its condemned to the very darkest beings that the hidden world contained. And it did so not out of cruelty exactly, but out of convenience. Because the Dementors asked for nothing but the despair they were given, and needed no wages and no rest and no watching, and would keep the fortress with a thoroughness no human guard could ever match. It was, in the cold language of policy, an efficient arrangement, and that efficiency was precisely its poison. For consider what it means to guard the boundary between order and darkness by inviting darkness itself to stand upon the wall. The Dementors have no loyalty. They have no love of the law and no fear of the minister, and no care for right or wrong. They keep the prison not because they believe in justice, but because the prison feeds them, because the despair of the captives is the very thing they hunger for, and they would keep any prison anywhere that offered them the same. A creature that serves you only for what it can devour is not truly your servant at all, but merely a hunger that happens, for now, to be pointed in a direction that suits you. And a hunger pointed toward your enemies today can be pointed toward you tomorrow, the moment someone offers it a richer feast, for it was never yours in the first place, only borrowed, only rented, only briefly aligned with your purpose by the accident of appetite. The ministry, in its comfortable certainty, seems never to have truly reckoned with this. It trusted the untrustworthy because the untrustworthy were useful. It leaned the whole weight of its justice against creatures that had no notion of justice and never would. It told itself, no doubt, that the arrangement was under control, that the Dementors were bound to the fortress and content with their charge, that a thing so dependable in its habits could be relied upon to remain where it was placed. But you cannot bind a hunger with a contract, and you cannot make a covenant with a thing that understands only feeding, and every year that the ministry rested its safety upon the Dementors was a year that it lived beside a danger it did not truly govern, a danger that merely had not yet found a reason to turn. And there is something darker still to notice here, softly, before we let the thoughts settle. The Dementors did not merely keep the prison, they shaped what the prison was. The horror of Azkaban that we spoke of before, the despair sunk into its very foundations, was not the work of stone and sea alone, but of these creatures gliding endlessly through its halls, draining the captives hour by hour. By employing them, the ministry did not simply hire guards. It chose the exact nature of the suffering it would inflict, chose that its prison would be a place not of confinement but of slow spiritual ruin, and then hid that choice behind the convenient truth that the Dementors were only doing what Dementors do. The government could hold its hands up and say that it had not made these creatures cruel, that their cruelty was in their nature, and that saying was true, and it was also a way of never facing that the ministry had gathered that cruelty up and set it deliberately to work. This is the pattern we have seen before and will see again, the pattern of a government that reaches for whatever is convenient and calls the consequences someone else's doing. The fortress was already terrible, so keep it. The creatures were already cruel, so use them. At every turn, the ministry chose the easy path of leaving darkness as it found it and bending it to a purpose, and at every turn it told itself that it had made nothing worse, that it had only managed what already existed. But to employ a horror is to own it, and to lean upon a darkness is to invite that darkness closer. And a wiser and braver government might have understood that the beings who feed on despair can never be safely made the keepers of anything at all. We will see, when the great darkness at last returns to the wizarding world, exactly what such a bargain was worth. We will see the Dementors, kept and fed and trusted for so long, turn from the ministry the moment a greater feast was offered them, and drift away to serve the very enemy the fortress was built to contain. But that betrayal, when it comes, will not truly be a surprise, for it was written into the arrangement from the very first day. A creature that serves only its hunger will always leave for the fuller table, and the ministry, in its long convenience, had raised its whole house of order upon exactly such a creature, and never let itself see the crack running through the foundation. For now, let all of that rest, and let the cold creatures fade back into the distance where they belong, far out over the gray sea, far from the warm and gentle dark in which you lie. You need not carry their chill with you. Understand it, and then release it, the way you release each slow breath into the quiet of the room. The ministry made a bargain with the darkness, because the darkness was useful, and that is the whole soft lesson of this chapter, that a power which trusts the untrustworthy to guard its gates has already, without knowing it, begun to open them. Let the thought settle like snow upon still water, and let it sink and let it go, and drift now, warm and safe and far from every cold thing, gently down toward sleep. Long before the boy who lived ever heard the name spoken with sorrow, before he learned that a godfather had once waited for him in the world, there was a young man named Sirius Black, and the Ministry of Magic decided his fate in a single afternoon without ever asking him to speak. It is a strange and heavy thing to consider, here in the quiet of the evening, that a whole life can be folded away like a letter and placed in a drawer that no one ever opens again, and that the hands which fold it away may believe, quite sincerely, that they are doing the necessary work of keeping the world safe. Sirius came from one of the oldest and proudest wizarding families in Britain, a family that treasured the purity of its blood and the darkness of its history, and he had spent his youth turning away from all of that, choosing instead the warmth of friends who loved him and the cause of those who fought against cruelty. He was, in the days before his ruin, a brave and loyal man, quick to laugh, and quicker still to stand between the ones he loved and any harm that came near them. And this is the part of the story that makes what followed so hard to hold gently in the mind. When the first great war against the darkest wizard came to its terrible turning point, and the parents of the boy who lived were betrayed and lost, the blame for that betrayal fell upon Sirius, swiftly and completely, before anyone had truly weighed the shape of the truth. To the eyes of the ministry, the case seemed already closed, for the evidence lay scattered in the street like something too obvious to question, and a crowd of frightened witnesses had seen what looked like guilt with their own eyes. There had been a great explosion in a crowded Muggle road, and many innocent people had died in an instant, and in the middle of the wreckage stood Sirius Black. And the man he was accused of murdering seemed to have vanished from the world entirely, leaving behind only a small and pitiful trace. To those who arrived after, it appeared as plain as daylight that this laughing pure-blood son had turned traitor, had served the dark, had betrayed his dearest friends, and then destroyed the one who tried to stop him. And the story fit so neatly that no one felt any need to loosen it. Yet the truth, as truth so often is, was folded within the appearance rather than laid open upon it, and the truth was very nearly the opposite of what everyone believed. The real betrayer was another man, a smaller and weaker friend who had hidden his cowardice behind a gentle face for years. And it was he who had sold the secret that doomed the parents of the boy who lived, and it was he who had staged that terrible scene in the street and then fled in a shape no one thought to look for. Sirius knew all of this in the very moment of his arrest, knew it with the awful clarity of a man watching his own life collapse for a crime he did not commit, and he was ready to say it, ready to explain, ready to lay his innocence before anyone who would listen. But the ministry, in its certainty and its haste, never gave him the chance to speak a single word in his defense, and this is the quiet heart of the injustice. That the door of justice was not merely closed to him, but was never opened at all. Consider, softly, what a trial is meant to be, for it is one of the oldest and kindest inventions of any people who wish to be fair. A trial is a pause, a deliberate slowing of the world, a promise that before a life is taken or locked away, someone will sit and listen, will turn the evidence over and over, will ask whether the obvious answer is the true one, will allow the accused to stand and tell their side of the tale. It is a fence built against the terrible speed of fear, a way of saying that even the most hated among us deserves the patience of being heard. And it was precisely this pause, this listening, this patience, that the Ministry of Magic chose not to give to Sirius Black, sending him instead directly to the cold fortress in the northern sea, without a hearing, without a judge weighing his account, without any of the careful ritual that separates justice from mere vengeance. In the panic of a war only just ended, in a wizarding world hungry to punish someone for its grief, the machinery of the ministry simply skipped the step that mattered most, and no one in that great institution stood up to insist that the step be kept. It is worth resting a while on how this could happen inside a government that surely thought of itself as lawful and good. For it was not a single wicked person who condemned Sirius, but a whole structure moving in a single frightened direction. The head of magical law enforcement in those days was a man who prized toughness above tenderness, and who had grown used to filling the prison quickly, and beneath him were officers weary of war and eager for the comfort of a case that seemed already solved. The newspapers wanted a name to print, the public wanted a villain to hate, and the government wanted to appear strong and decisive in a moment of national fear, and all of these ordinary wishes flowed together into one smooth current that carried Sirius out to sea without a trial. No one, it seems, paused to feel the strange wrongness of a proud and loyal young man suddenly cast as the darkest of traitors, and no one asked the simple questions that might have unraveled the whole knot, and so the knot held, and a life was lost inside it. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears no cruel face, and this was that kind. The cruelty of a system that harms not through malice, but through its own certainty and its own speed. The men and women who sent Sirius away did not, in that moment, believe themselves to be doing evil, for they believed they were protecting the innocent from a murderer, And it is exactly this belief that made the injustice possible. Because a person who thinks they are certain feels no need to look closer. The ministry had built itself upon procedures and stamps and the folding of paper birds, upon the comfortable assumption that its own workings were fair. And yet in the one moment when fairness required a little more effort than usual, the effort was not made. The fortress swallowed him, the cold sea closed the way behind him, and the file of his case was set aside as finished, and the world moved on believing that justice had been done, when in truth justice had never even begun. And so we lay this first half of his sorrow down gently for the night, the story of a man who was never tried, a man whose only crime was to be caught inside a lie he had not told, standing in the wrong street at the wrong hour, with the truth locked helpless behind his lips. Let it settle in the mind, not as an outrage to keep you awake, but as a slow and sorrowful lesson about the machine that governs the hidden world. The lesson that fear can hollow out even the forms of justice and leave only their empty shells behind. Sirius Black went out across the gray water to a place built of despair, carrying with him the one thing the ministry could not take, the plain and stubborn knowledge that he had done no wrong, and tomorrow that fortress and those long gray years will wait for us to speak of them. For now, let the waves rock quietly in the distance of your thoughts. Let the cell door remain in shadow, and let the injustice rest, unfinished and unhealed, in the softness before sleep. Now we come to the long gray heart of the sorrow, to the years themselves, to the slow unrolling of time inside the cold fortress in the northern sea where Sirius Black was left to remain. 12 years is a number easy to say and almost impossible to feel. For it is more than 4,000 days, more than 140 turnings of the moon. A stretch of life long enough for a small child to grow into a young person, long enough for seasons to circle round again and again, while nothing at all changes for the one who is kept inside. And through every one of those days and every one of those nights, Sirius sat within the reach of the Dementors, the creatures whose very presence draws the warmth out of the air and the joy out of the mind, so that the punishment he suffered was not merely the loss of freedom, but the slow and patient theft of every happy memory he had ever made. To understand what those years took from him, it helps to picture, softly and without fear, the nature of the place itself. The fortress stands alone upon a small island far out, where the sea is always cold and the sky is nearly always gray, and no warmth reaches it, and no comfort, and no kind word. The Dementors glide through its corridors without hurry, for they have all the time in the world, and wherever they pass, they leave behind a chill that settles into the bones and a heaviness that settles into the heart, and every prisoner within those walls relives their worst moments over and over as the creatures feed upon whatever brightness remains. Most who were sent there did not last, for the mind, under such a weight, begins to fray and to loosen, and many of the fortress prisoners sank into a kind of living emptiness, forgetting their own names, forgetting the faces of those they had loved, becoming little more than shells that breathed. This was the fate the ministry considered acceptable. This was the price it had decided was worth paying for the appearance of order. And into this slow dissolving it had cast a man who had done nothing to deserve it. Yet Sirius did not dissolve, and the reason he did not is one of the strangest and quietest miracles of the whole long tale. The Dementors feed most easily upon happy memories, upon warmth and love and hope, upon all the golden human feelings that make a life worth living. But they cannot so easily reach a thought that is not happy at all, a thought that is hard and cold and stubborn as stone. And Sirius held to exactly such a thought, the plain and joyless knowledge that he was innocent, the flat certain fact that he had not committed the crime for which he had been condemned. And because this knowledge brought him no warmth and no comfort. The creatures could find nothing in it to consume. It was not a happy thought, and so it did not feed them. And it was not a false thought, and so it did not fade. And he wrapped himself in it the way a man lost in the snow might wrap himself in the one blanket he has left. Not to feel joy, but simply to keep from vanishing entirely. He survived, not by remembering love, but by remembering truth. And there is something both terrible and beautiful in that the very thing which saved him was the injustice done to him, held close and never released. While he endured this, the Ministry of Magic did nothing at all, and it is in this doing of nothing that the second great wrong reveals itself. For it is one thing to make a mistake in the heat and fear of a war just ended, when the world is crying out for someone to blame, and the mind of a whole nation is clouded with grief. And it is quite another thing to make that mistake and then never once look back upon it across 12 long years of quiet. The war ended, the fear cooled, the world settled into peace, and in all that time, no one at the ministry ever reopened the file, never wondered whether the obvious answer had been the true one, never asked whether the proud, loyal young man they had condemned might have been telling a story no one let him tell. His case was not a wound the institution worked to heal, but a wound it simply forgot. And forgetting, when a man is suffering because of you, is its own particular kind of cruelty. A cruelty made not of action, but of the absence of any thought at all. Imagine, gently, how the seasons must have passed for him inside that stone. Somewhere far away, children were being born and growing, friends were meeting and marrying. The boy his dearest friends had left behind was learning to walk, and then to speak, and then to read. And Sirius knew none of it, saw none of it, was allowed to share in none of it. The gulls called over the cold water, and the tides rose and fell against the rocks, and inside the fortress the light through the narrow window shifted a little from summer to winter, and back again. And still the door did not open, and still no one came to say that a mistake had been found, and still the years piled softly, one upon another, like snow upon a roof. He grew thin and gray and hollow, his laughter long since silenced, his youth spent entirely within 4 cold walls, and the government that had placed him there had by then almost entirely ceased to think of him. Its attention moved on to newer matters, its files closed, its conscience untroubled, because a machine has no conscience to trouble. And here we may pause to feel the true weight of what an institution can do. For the harm done to Sirius Black was not the work of a monster in the ordinary sense, not a cackling villain delighting in another man's pain. It was the work of a government that valued its own certainty more than the careful search for truth. A government too proud to wonder whether it had been wrong and too slow to bother finding out. And this is a far quieter danger than the danger of open evil, and in some ways a far more frightening one. A villain can be named and fought and defeated, but a mistake that no one revisits, a suffering that no one remembers, an injustice folded away inside a drawer that no one opens, has no single face to blame and no single heart to change, and so it simply endures year after year, as untroubled as the tide. The ministry did not hate Sirius Black. It had merely stopped thinking about him at all, and for a man alone among the Dementors, being forgotten was very nearly the cruelest thing of all. So let us lay these long years down now, softly, the way one lays down a heavy thing at the end of a long day, and let the fortress recede into the gray distance of the mind. Sirius survived, holding to his one cold, stubborn truth, and though his freedom would one day come to him through his own strange courage, rather than through any justice offered by the ministry, that is a tale for other nights and other tellings. For now, let it be enough to know that a man endured what almost no one endures, that he kept his self intact against the patient hunger of despair, and that the government, meant to protect him instead, left him to the cold and turned its attention elsewhere. Rest now, and let the tide come in slow and even over the rocks, and let the long gray years of Sirius Black settle at last into the deep, quiet water of sleep, where old wrongs grow still, and the heart, at least for a while, is allowed to be warm again. To understand how a government could send a man to the cold fortress without ever letting him speak, we must go back a little in time, to the years of the First Great War. And we must sit for a while with a man named Bartemius Crouch, who led the Department of Magical Law Enforcement in those dark and frightened days. He is a figure worth considering slowly, here in the softness of the evening, because he was not a villain in the way we usually imagine villains, not cruel for the pleasure of cruelty, not hungry for power in the greedy, obvious way. He was, in truth, a man of great ability and great ambition, hardworking and clever and devoted to the law. A man who spoke many languages and mastered many rules and rose swiftly through the ranks of the ministry, and a man who believed with his whole heart that he was fighting on the side of good. And this is precisely what makes his story so quietly troubling, for it shows how a person may begin with the honest wish to protect the innocent and end by becoming almost indistinguishable from the darkness he set out to fight. In those days, the wizarding world was afraid, as it had rarely been afraid before. For the darkest wizard and his followers were spreading terror across the country, striking without warning, killing without mercy. And no one knew who among their neighbors might secretly serve the shadow. Fear of that kind does strange things to a people and to the governments that lead them, for it makes the slow and careful ways of justice seem suddenly like weakness, like a luxury that times can no longer afford, and it makes the hard and swift ways seem like strength and safety. Barty Crouch understood this mood, and he embodied it, standing before the frightened world as the very picture of firmness, the man who would not flinch, the man who would meet darkness with an iron hand, and the frightened world loved him for it and looked to him for its rescue. He was widely admired, widely expected to become Minister of Magic himself one day, and his popularity rested entirely upon the appearance of unbending strength, upon the promise that he would do whatever needed doing without any softness getting in the way. But strength of that kind has a price, and the price is nearly always paid by someone other than the man who wears the strength. And in Crouch's case, the price was paid by the innocent and by the ordinary protections of the law. To fight the dark more quickly, he authorized his own officers to use the unforgivable curses against the followers of the shadow, the very curses that the dark side used, so that the line between the hunters and the hunted began to blur and thin. To fill the fortress more quickly, he allowed suspects to be sent there on suspicion alone, without the patient weighing of evidence, without the pause of a proper trial, condemned upon the strength of a pointed finger or a frightened accusation. He treated the mere suspicion of darkness as though it were proof of darkness, and in doing so, he handed to fear the power that ought to belong only to careful truth, and few asked whether this was wise. Because in a frightened time, a hard man is admired and rarely questioned. His severity was mistaken for justice, his ruthlessness for courage, and the crowd that cheered him did not stop to count how many innocent people might be swept up in a net cast so wide and so quickly. It was under exactly this way of thinking, this worship of toughness over truth, that a man like Sirius Black could be sent across the gray water without a hearing. For the machinery of law enforcement had by then grown used to acting first and asking nothing, used to trusting the obvious answer, used to treating the pause of justice as a weakness it could not afford. The rule of fear that Crouch built did not end with him, but became a habit within the institution, a way of moving that outlasted the particular emergency that had birthed it. And this is one of the quiet dangers of allowing hard measures in hard times. that the hardness does not always soften again when the times grow gentle. A government that learns to skip the careful steps in a crisis may find that it has forgotten how to take those steps at all. And the men and women trained to fill a prison swiftly do not easily unlearn the swiftness. And so the shortcut becomes the road, and the emergency measure becomes the ordinary way, and no one quite notices the moment it happens. There is a lesson folded within all of this that is worth turning over slowly in the mind, and it is a lesson not about wicked men, but about the strange way that virtue itself can curdle into harm. Crouch was not lazy or cowardly or corrupt, and in that he was almost the opposite of the frightened minister who would come later in the story. For he was diligent and brave and honest according to his own understanding, and yet the harm he did was very great. He did that harm not in spite of his devotion to the law, but through it, because his devotion had narrowed into a single idea, the idea that the darkness must be defeated at any cost, and once a cost is declared acceptable in advance, there is almost no limit to what may be spent. The innocent became, in his mind, an acceptable loss, a small price for the greater safety. And the moment a government begins to think of the innocent as a price it is willing to pay, it has already taken a long step toward becoming the very thing it claims to oppose. He wished to protect the good people of the wizarding world, and to protect them he was willing to abandon the protections that make people safe from their own government, and he never seemed to see the contradiction sitting quietly at the center of everything he did. And so the man who was admired above nearly all others became, without quite meaning to, a builder of the very injustice that would swallow the innocent whole. And the hardness he was praised for became a hardness that reached back and hollowed out even his own life, though that part of his sorrow belongs to the telling that comes after this one. For now it is enough to sit with the shape of the man himself, the diligent servant of the law who forgot that the law is meant to be a shelter and not a weapon, the strong figure whose strength was purchased with other people's freedom, the honest official whose certainty left no room for the mercy of doubt. He is a warning drawn not in the bright colors of villainy, but in the gray tones of ordinary error, the error of a good man who loved order more than he loved fairness, and who never noticed the difference until it was far too late. Let this rest gently now, in the quiet before sleep, this picture of a government that came to worship toughness and mistook it for justice, this reminder that the machinery which condemned Sirius did not arise from nowhere, but was shaped by hands that believed themselves to be doing right. There is no need to feel anger toward Barty Crouch as the eyes grow heavy, only a soft and thoughtful sorrow, the kind of sorrow one feels for a wrong turn taken long ago by someone who truly meant to go the other way. The frightened world cheered its hard protector and did not see the cost, and the cost went on being paid quietly by those with no voice to protest. And tomorrow we will see how that same hardness came at last for the man's own family. But for now, let the fear of those old dark days settle and cool. Let the iron hand relax and grow still, and let sleep come softly over the memory of a strength that cost too much. There is a particular sorrow in watching a hard man tested by the one thing that might have softened him. And this is the sorrow we come to now, the story of how Barty Crouch, who had sent so many suspected servants of the darkness across the gray water without patience or proof, at last found his own son standing accused among them. For the man who had built his whole reputation upon the promise that he would never flinch, upon the iron certainty that darkness must be met with darkness and suspicion treated as guilt, was given, in the cruelest possible way, the chance to discover whether his hardness could bend when the price of it came to rest upon his own house. And the answer, when it came, was terrible in its consistency. For he did not bend, And in refusing to bend, he broke something in himself that could never be mended. And the ruin of his family became the quiet ending toward which all his years of severity had been leading without his ever knowing it. His son was young, hardly more than a boy in the eyes of many, and he was accused of having fallen in with the followers of the shadow, of having taken part in a cruel and dreadful act against a family of good and gentle people. Whether the young man was truly guilty, or whether he had been caught up among worse companions and swept along by them, or whether the truth lay somewhere tangled between those two things, is a question the story leaves shadowed and uncertain. For the trial that might have waited fairly was not, in the end, a fair trial at all. It was instead a great public spectacle held before a watching crowd, and the man who sat in judgment over it was the boy's own father, and the father, faced with the choice between his child and his reputation, between mercy and the appearance of unbending strength, chose the strength. He showed his son no more patience than he had shown any stranger dragged before him, no softening of the hard rules he had made, no willingness to slow the machinery even for his own flesh and blood. And he sent the young man across the water to the cold fortress as he had sent so many others. It is worth resting here for a moment upon the strangeness of that choice, upon how it reveals the true shape of the man beneath all his diligence and skill. A gentler father might have recused himself, might have stepped aside and let another weigh the case with clearer eyes, might at the very least have listened with the full attention that a parent owes a child. But Crouch did none of these things. He seemed almost to see in the moment an opportunity to prove, before the whole watching world, that his firmness was so complete that not even his own son could purchase an exception from it. And there is something both admirable and horrifying in that. A devotion to principle so total that it had lost all sense of proportion and all room for love. He mistook the refusal of mercy for a kind of integrity, and he did not seem to understand that a justice which cannot make room for the human heart is not really justice at all, but only a cold and hollow imitation of it, wearing the robes of fairness while lacking its living soul. The consequences of that day did not fall upon the son alone, but spread outward through the whole small world of the family, like a crack spreading through glass. The boy's mother, gentle and grieving, and unable to bear the loss of her only child to that dreadful place, was said to have arranged a desperate and secret thing in the end, a switching of one prisoner for another so that her son might die free rather than caged, a sacrifice of her own life so that his might be spared the fortress. And so the family that had seemed, from the outside, a picture of respectable strength was quietly consumed from within. The mother lost to grief and sacrifice, the son lost to shame and hiding, and the father left alone at the center of the ruin he had helped to make, surrounded by the silence of a house that no longer held anyone he loved. His ambition to become minister of magic faded, for the scandal clung to him, and the hard, bright future he had imagined for himself dissolved into a long gray twilight of duty and regret and slowly deepening isolation. And here the deepest lesson of his story rises quietly to the surface. The lesson that a government which worships toughness will in the end devour even those who serve it most faithfully, even those who built the very altar upon which it worships. Barty Crouch had given the ministry his whole life, had made himself the perfect servant of its hardest instincts, had asked for no mercy and offered none, and the machinery he helped to build did not spare him in return, for machinery never does. It took his son, it took his wife, it took his name and his future, and at last very nearly his mind, and it did all of this not as a punishment for any failure on his part, but simply as the natural working out of the principles he had championed. For a system that treats suspicion as guilt and refuses the mercy of doubt will eventually turn that cold logic upon anyone at all, including its own architects. He had helped to teach the ministry that the innocent were an acceptable price, and in time the ministry collected that price from his own family, and there is a dreadful fairness in that, though it brought no comfort and no justice to anyone. The man who remained after all of this was a hollow one, correct and severe on the outside, ruined and haunted within. A figure who went on performing his duties with the same rigid precision, even as everything that might have given those duties meaning had crumbled away beneath him. He is a warning of a very particular kind, not the warning of the wicked man who chooses evil openly, but the warning of the rigid man who mistakes his rigidity for virtue and follows it faithfully all the way down into desolation. His severity was praised while it destroyed strangers, and it was still severity when it destroyed his son, and it was severity to the very end when it had destroyed himself, unchanged and unbending, as though bending even once would have been a defeat worse than any loss. And in his refusal ever to bend we may see, softly and without anger, the whole tragedy of a government that had forgotten that the purpose of law is to shelter people rather than to crush them. So let us lay this last piece of his sorrow down gently now, as the eyes grow heavy and the room grows dim, and let the ruined family of Barty Crouch recede into the quiet past where old griefs are allowed at last to rest. There is no lesson here to keep you awake, only a slow and thoughtful sadness, the kind that settles the heart rather than stirring it. The recognition that hardness carried too far will consume everything it touches, beginning with strangers and ending with those we love most and with our own selves last of all. The father who would not spare his son was faithful to the end to the cold idea that had already cost so much, and that faithfulness was his undoing, and in his undoing the whole rule of fear reveals its true and hollow nature. Rest now, and let the old scandal fade, and let the cold logic of that vanished government grow soft and distant, and let sleep come over the memory of a family that a machine devoured, until nothing remains but the quiet and the warmth and the deep and gentle dark. There comes a moment in the long history of any government when the truth arrives at its door and asks quietly to be let in, and the whole future of that government turns upon whether the door is opened or held shut. For the Ministry of Magic, that moment came on a warm evening at the close of a school year, when the darkest wizard the world had known in a generation returned to a body of his own, and a single exhausted boy carried the news of it back into the light. The boy had seen the thing happen with his own eyes, had stood in a graveyard among the risen dead and the masked and the fearful, and had come home changed by it, and all he asked was to be believed. What he found instead was a man who could not bear to believe, a man whose name was Cornelius Fudge, and who held the highest office the wizarding world could offer. Fudge had been minister for a long and comfortable stretch of years. Years without great war or great catastrophe. Years in which the ordinary business of stamps and permits and mild reforms had let him feel that he was steering the world gently along. He had grown fond of that feeling, fond of the deference of others, fond of the lime-green bowler hat he wore, and the sense that the whole delicate machine of magical Britain was in his careful keeping. He was not a cruel man, and this is the part that must be understood before anything else, for the harm he did was not born of malice, but of something far more common and far more human, which was the simple wish that a frightening thing might not be true. When the news reached him that the dark wizard had returned, Fudge felt the ground of his comfortable years begin to tremble, and rather than steady himself upon the truth, he chose to look away from it. To accept the return would mean the end of peace, the reopening of old wounds, the calling up of terrors the wizarding world had spent a decade trying to forget. It would mean war, and the labor of war, and the possibility that under his watch everything might come undone. It would mean that his long and gentle stewardship had ended not in quiet retirement, but in disaster, and that thought was more than he could hold. So he did what frightened men have always done, which was to decide that the messenger must be mistaken, and that the world could go on as before if only everyone agreed to say that it would. He told himself a story, and the story was soothing, and he repeated it until it felt like knowledge. The story was that the boy was confused, that grief and shock had unsettled him, that a single tragic death in a graveyard was terrible enough without inventing a returned Dark Lord to explain it. The story was that the old headmaster who supported the boy had reasons of his own, ambitions of his own, a hunger for influence that made him magnify shadows into monsters. The story was that everything was well, that the world was safe, that the minister need do nothing but wait, and the fear would pass. And because the story was pleasant, and the truth was dreadful, Fudge held to the story with all the stubborn strength that a frightened man can find. The tragedy of this denial was not only that it was wrong, but that it was expensive, and the ones who paid its price were not the minister himself, but the countless ordinary people who trusted him to see clearly on their behalf. For a full year, the returning darkness was allowed to grow in secret, to gather its old servants and recruit new ones, to move quietly through the corners of the world, unopposed by the one institution built to oppose it. Every month that the ministry spent denying the danger was a month the enemy spent preparing for it, and the great machine of law and enforcement, which might have risen at the first warning to meet the threat, instead sat idle and content, guarding a peace that no longer existed. There is a particular loneliness in being right when the powerful have agreed to be wrong, and the boy who carried the truth felt every ounce of it that year. He watched the adults he had trusted turn their faces from what he knew, watched the minister he had once respected treat his honesty as a symptom rather than a warning, and learned the hard and ancient lesson that a government does not always want the truth, that sometimes it wants only to be left in peace. The wisest among the boy's protectors understood the danger of the delay, understood that every day of denial handed a gift to the enemy, but their understanding could not move a minister who had decided in his heart that the whole matter was closed. It would be too simple to call Fudge a villain in this, and the gentle honesty of this telling asks us to see him more clearly than that. He was a man who loved his comfort more than he loved the truth, which is a smaller and sadder failing than open wickedness, and yet its consequences were nearly as vast. The dark wizard wished the world to be blind to his return, and Fudge, without ever meaning to serve him, gave him exactly the blindness he wished for. There is no need to imagine the minister plotting in shadows, for he did his damage in the full light of his own good intentions, insisting all the while that he was protecting the very people his denial left undefended. It is worth pausing to consider how a single decision, made quietly and never truly examined, could reach so far into so many lives. When the head of a great institution chooses to believe a comforting thing, that belief does not remain his alone, for it flows down through every office beneath him and colors every decision the machine below him makes. The officials who might have raised the alarm looked to the minister and saw calm, and took their cue from that calm, and so the whole structure settled deeper into its false peace. No one of them was to blame in particular, and that was precisely the trouble, for the denial had been woven into the very fabric of the government, and a thing that belongs to everyone belongs, in the end, to no one. And all the while the truth waited, unchanged by how many chose not to see it, patient in the way that true things always are. The dark wizard grew stronger not because he was cunning beyond measure, but simply because he was left alone, given the one gift a returning evil most desires, which is time and quiet in which to gather. Every warning that went unheeded, every day the ministry spent reassuring itself that all was well, was another small stone laid in the foundation of the disaster to come. The denial felt, from the inside, like nothing at all, like the ordinary continuation of ordinary days, and that was the deepest deception of it. And so the year turned, and the danger deepened, and the ministry of magic held its door shut against the truth that stood patiently outside. The paper birds still folded themselves and flew along the corridors. The departments still stamped their forms and filed their reports. The great slow machines still hummed along as though nothing in the world had changed. But something had changed, something enormous and terrible, and the refusal to name it did not make it any less real. This is the first great lesson of the ministry's failing. The lesson that a government can wound its people not through what it does, but through what it refuses to see, and that the quiet closing of a door against an unwelcome truth can echo louder in the end than any spoken curse. Let the mind rest a moment upon that image, the door held shut, the truth waiting patiently in the dark outside, the frightened man within telling himself that all is well. There is no drama in it, no clash of wands, only a tired official choosing the easier path and calling that choice wisdom. It is the quietest kind of failure, and perhaps for that reason, the most dangerous, for it wears the face of prudence and speaks in the reassuring tones of a man who only wants everyone to be calm. Rest now upon that thought and carry it gently forward, for the story of what that denial cost is only beginning, and the night is long, and there is time enough to follow it all the way to its end. To understand the denial of Cornelius Fudge fully, it helps to sit a while with the strange and gentle comfort that looking away can bring, for it is a comfort that nearly every soul has tasted at one time or another, and there is no cruelty in naming it. When a thing is too heavy to carry, the mind grows clever at pretending the thing is not there, and this cleverness feels for a while like relief, like the loosening of a weight, like a warm room shut against a cold night. Fudge lived inside that warm room for a full year, and he arranged its furniture so that nothing within it would remind him of the cold pressing at the walls, and for a time he was almost at peace. The comfort of looking away is built from small and reasonable pieces, each one sensible on its own, and it is only when they are gathered together that they form a wall thick enough to keep the truth outside. There was the reasonable thought that the boy was young and had suffered a shock, and surely the young and the grieving may be forgiven for seeing things that are not there. There was the reasonable thought that the old headmaster had always been a difficult figure, brilliant certainly, but proud, and perhaps too fond of standing at the center of great events. There was the reasonable thought that the world had only just healed from its last long terror, and that to reopen that wound without certainty would be a cruelty in itself. Each of these thoughts was gentle, and each was defensible, and Fudge leaned upon all of them at once, and together they held his door shut against the dark. What made the comfort so seductive was that it asked nothing of him, while the truth would have asked everything. To believe the boy would have meant summoning the old fighters, rearming the defenses, warning the people, admitting his own long blindness, and shouldering the immense and thankless labor of a war he had prayed never to see. To disbelieve the boy asked only that Fudge continue exactly as he was, that he wake each morning to the same corridors and the same deferences and the same soft certainty that he was doing well. One path was made entirely of effort and fear, and the other was made entirely of rest, and it is no great mystery which path a tired and frightened man was inclined to choose. The comfort of looking away is always the path of least effort, and that is precisely why it is so dangerous, for the easy road and the right road are so rarely the same. There is a quiet cowardice in this kind of comfort, though it is a cowardice so common that we hardly recognize it as such. And it does not announce itself with trembling or flight. It announces itself instead with a reassuring smile, with a firm handshake, with confident words about stability and calm and the importance of not frightening the public. Fudge did not feel himself to be a coward, and in the ordinary business of his office he was not one. But when the great test came, he failed it not by running from danger, but by refusing to admit that danger existed. This is the subtle shape of the failing, that it can feel like courage from the inside, like a steady hand refusing to be panicked, when in truth it is only the mind protecting itself from a thing it does not wish to hold. And the price of this comfort, we must always remember, was not paid by the comfortable man alone. When a private person looks away from a hard truth, the harm falls mostly upon that person. But when a minister looks away, the harm spreads outward through every home and every life that depends upon his sight. Fudge sat in the warm room of his denial, while the cold gathered outside for everyone, and the ordinary families who trusted the ministry to watch the horizon on their behalf were left, without ever knowing it, unwatched and undefended. The comfort was his, but the danger it purchased belonged to a whole nation, and this is the terrible arithmetic of power, that the ease of the few at the top can be bought with the safety of the many below. Think of how a small denial can grow, gently and without alarm, into something large enough to shape the fate of a nation. It begins as a single thought turned away from, a single hard fact set aside for another day, and it feels at first like nothing, like the harmless postponing of an unpleasant chore. But a denial must be fed to be kept alive, and each day it demands a little more. Another reason to doubt the boy, another explanation for the troubling signs, another gentle dismissal of the mounting evidence, until the keeping of the denial becomes a labor in itself. Fudge, without noticing the moment it happened, had built his whole understanding of the world upon the wish that one thing not be true. And a house built upon a wish stands only so long as no one looks too closely at its foundation. It is worth pausing here to feel some tenderness even for the man who failed, for the story is gentler and truer if we do not turn him into a monster. Fudge was frightened in the way that ordinary people are frightened, of loss, of upheaval, of the collapse of a comfortable world, and his failing grew from that fear rather than from any hunger to do harm. Had he been a private citizen, his weakness would have been an ordinary human weakness, forgivable and small, the sort of thing we all carry. It was only the great office resting upon his shoulders that turned an ordinary weakness into an extraordinary wound. And this is perhaps the quiet warning at the heart of it, that the higher a person climbs, the more the common failings of the human heart can cost the world below. The danger the ministry represented was never chiefly a danger of dark magic or open malice. For those are dangers the world knows how to fear and how to fight. The deeper danger was this softer one, the danger that an ordinary man of ordinary weakness might come to sit at the top of a great machine, and might steer that machine, gently and without evil intent, straight into disaster simply by declining to look where it was going. A curse can be blocked, and a duelist can be met. But how does a nation defend itself against the mild and reasonable wish of its leader to be left in peace? That is a harder thing to guard against, precisely because it looks so harmless, and because the man at the center of it believes with all his heart that he is keeping everyone safe. There is a further gentleness worth naming here, which is that the comfort of looking away rarely feels like a choice at all, and this is part of why it is so hard to guard against. A person who decides outright to do wrong at least knows what he is doing and may be argued with or stopped or brought to see reason. But the man who is only looking away does not feel himself to be choosing anything, for he has arranged his gaze so that the hard thing falls outside it, and within his own view all is calm and well. Fudge did not wake each morning and resolve to endanger his people, for in his own eyes he was merely keeping steady, keeping calm, refusing to be stampeded by rumor. The failing hid itself from the very man committing it, and a failing that cannot be seen by the one who commits it will not easily be corrected. So the year of comfort passed, and the warm room held, and outside the cold grew patient and deep. Fudge slept soundly through most of it, we may suppose, untroubled by the truth he had shut away, reassured by the many reasonable thoughts he had gathered around himself like blankets against the night. And the great lesson settles over the whole of it like a soft and falling snow. The lesson that the most ordinary weakness at the top of things can wound a people as deeply as any spell, and that the gentle wish to look away, so understandable, so human, so very like a thing we have all wished for ourselves, can in the wrong seat open every door the darkness needs. Rest now upon that thought, without fear and without judgment, and let it settle into stillness. For the night is long, and the telling is slow, and there is time enough to carry it gently onward. A denial, once chosen, is a fragile thing, for the truth it refuses does not vanish, but waits nearby, and anyone who speaks that truth aloud becomes a threat to the comfortable silence. So it was that Cornelius Fudge, having decided the dark wizard had not returned, found himself with a problem, and the problem was a boy who insisted otherwise. The boy had seen the return, had said so plainly, and would go on saying so, and every time he spoke, he threatened to crack the smooth surface of the ministry's calm. A frightened government facing an inconvenient truth has always had two choices, either to face the truth or to silence the one who tells it, and the ministry, unwilling to face what it feared, turned instead upon the child who would not stay quiet. The weapon the ministry reached for was not a wand, but a printing press, for it had long enjoyed a close and comfortable friendship with the great newspaper of the wizarding world, the paper that arrived by owl at nearly every breakfast table in magical Britain. That paper shaped what ordinary people believed, told them what was true and what was foolish, decided which names were spoken with respect and which with a knowing smirk. And so, without any single dramatic order, without shouting or open command, the whole soft weight of the state began to press down upon the reputation of a single 15-year-old boy, patiently, steadily, day after printed day. It was a campaign carried out in ink rather than blood, and for that reason it looked almost gentle, and was in truth a kind of cruelty all its own. The campaign did not call the boy a monster, for that would have been too obvious and too easily doubted. Instead, it painted him as something smaller and more pitiable, a troubled child hungry for attention, a boy so desperate to be noticed that he would invent terrors and cry them aloud to keep every eye upon himself. Little remarks were dropped into unrelated stories, small barbs about his instability, sly suggestions that his tales grew wilder each year, quiet mockery dressed as concern. The reader was never told outright to despise him, only nudged, gently and repeatedly, toward the comfortable conclusion that the boy was not to be believed, and the nudging was all the more effective for being so mild. Drop by drop the poison went into the well, and drop by drop the wizarding world drank it, until a great many people who had never met the boy felt sure they understood exactly what sort of liar he was. There is a particular cruelty in turning the whole apparatus of a state against one child. And it is worth sitting with that cruelty for a moment, gently, to feel its true weight. The boy had done nothing but tell the truth, had asked for nothing but to be believed, had carried a warning at real cost to himself, and in return, the government spent its immense influence teaching a nation to laugh at him. He walked into a new school year to find that strangers stared and whispered, that people he had never wronged looked at him with contempt or pity, that the story of who he was had been written for him by hands he could not reach. A grown man of power and standing might have weathered such a campaign, might have had lawyers and allies and platforms of his own, but this was a boy, alone in his knowledge, and the state pressed down upon him with the full and patient weight of its authority. The reason for the campaign was never truly about the boy at all, and this is the part that reveals the deepest failing of the ministry. Harry was attacked not because he was dangerous, but because he was inconvenient, not because his words were false, but precisely because they were true, and a true word spoken at the wrong moment is the most threatening thing in the world to a power that has staked itself on a lie. Had the boy been mistaken, the ministry could have corrected him gently and moved on. It was his accuracy that made him intolerable. For every day he stood as living proof that the government had chosen comfort over truth, and so the government set out to make that proof unbelievable. The whole vast campaign was, at its heart, an effort to protect one man's denial from one boy's honesty. Consider what it means that a government would rather discredit a child than examine its own comfortable assumptions. For that choice tells us something lasting about the nature of institutions and the men who run them. It is easier to attack the messenger than to reconsider the message. Easier to make a nation doubt one boy than to admit that the whole leadership has been wrong. And the easier path is nearly always the one that frightened power will choose. The ministry had grown so invested in its own calm that the calm itself became the thing it defended, more precious to it than the safety of the people, more precious even than the truth. And any voice that disturbed the calm was treated not as a warning to be heeded, but as a nuisance to be silenced. There is something worth noticing in how quietly such a campaign does its work, for it never needs a single grand and memorable lie. It needs only a steady drizzle of small ones, each too slight to argue with, each easy to shrug away on its own, and it trusts to their slow and patient accumulation to do what no single grand falsehood ever could. A reader who would reject an outright accusation will absorb 100 gentle insinuations without noticing, until one morning he finds that he has formed an opinion he never chose, built for him grain by grain out of 1,000 small suggestions. This is the craft of it, and it is a craft the ministry practiced with terrible skill, for it understood that people are seldom argued into contempt, but are easily nudged into it, drop by drop, over the slow turning of days. And yet, the campaign, for all its patient cruelty, could not touch the one thing that mattered, which was that the boy was right. The ink could shape opinions, but it could not reshape reality. The whispers could turn a crowd, but they could not turn back the dark wizard, gathering his strength in the shadows. Every printed mockery was a small betrayal of the very readers it deceived, for it lulled them deeper into a false safety while the real danger came closer. And the more successfully the ministry discredited its warning, the more defenseless it left the people who believed the discrediting. There is a bitter irony woven all through it, that the state harmed its citizens most, not by lying about a monster, but by lying about the child who tried to warn them of one. So let the mind rest upon the strange and sorrowful shape of it. A government of grown and powerful people, bending the whole weight of the state to convince a nation that a truthful boy was a liar, all so that a frightened man might keep his comfortable peace a little longer. There was no thunder in it, and no open violence, only the soft daily fall of ink and whisper and knowing smile. The quietest kind of assault, aimed at the reputation of one who had done no wrong. It is a lesson worth carrying gently into sleep, that the machinery meant to inform a people can be turned to deceive them, and that the loudest voice in a nation can be spent, patiently and without conscience, to drown out the one small, honest voice that was trying all along to keep everyone safe. Rest now, and let that sorrow settle softly into stillness, for the night is long, and the telling goes on. There was another voice the ministry needed to silence, older and wiser, and far harder to mock than a boy, and it belonged to the aged headmaster who stood behind the boy and believed him. Albus Dumbledore had warned of the darkness for longer than most, had watched its patterns and understood its returns, and when he added his own voice to the boy's, the whole comfortable denial of the ministry trembled. For a minister might dismiss a troubled child, but he could not so easily dismiss the greatest wizard of the age, the one man whose judgment the wider world trusted above his own. And so the government, having set out to discredit the boy, turned the same patient machinery upon the old man who stood beside him. And the campaign against the child became a campaign against the sage as well. What made Dumbledore so dangerous to the ministry was not that he was wrong, but that he was widely believed to be right, and a leader who is believed can move the hearts of many. Fudge had long carried a private unease about the old headmaster, a suspicion nursed in the quiet corners of his mind, that so brilliant and so beloved a figure might one day desire the minister's own chair. It was a suspicion without foundation, for the old man had been offered high office more than once across the long years, and had turned it away each time, preferring the school and the students to the corridors of power. Yet a frightened man is quick to imagine rivals, and Fudge, needing a reason to distrust the voice that contradicted him, seized upon the comfortable fiction that the headmaster's warnings were only the opening moves of an ambitious grab for control. Once that fiction took hold, the rest followed with a dreary and predictable logic, and the ministry set about the work of pulling down the reputation it had once revered. The same newspaper that mocked the boy now turned its columns upon the old man, painting him not as a wise elder, but as a fading figure, past his prime, grasping at shadows to make himself important, spreading tales of a returned dark lord to frighten the public into rallying around him. Where once his name had commanded respect, it was now spoken with a pitying shake of the head, the name of a great man supposedly gone soft in his old age. Day by day the picture was redrawn, until a wizard who had given his whole long life to the protection of the world was recast as a doddering schemer, hungry for a power he had spent that same life refusing. The ministry did not stop at words, for denial, once it hardens, reaches always for action. And so it moved to strip the old man of the offices and honors that gave his voice its weight. He was removed from the great councils of the wizarding world, cast out of the seats of judgment and governance he had long occupied, his titles taken one by one, as though a lifetime of service could be unspooled by a vote. The reasoning offered was always about his supposed instability, his dangerous tales, his fitness to hold high position, but the true reason was far simpler and far less noble, which was that he would not be quiet, and would not agree that all was well, and would not lend his great authority to a lie. A government that could not answer his warnings chose instead to unmake the man who spoke them. Consider the strangeness and the sorrow of this, that in the very hour when the wizarding world most needed its wisest head, the ministry spent its energy tearing that head down. Here was the one figure who saw the danger clearly, who understood the enemy better than any living soul, who might have led the defense that the frightened minister was unwilling to raise. And the government's response to such a gift was to silence him, mock him, and cast him from its councils. It was as though a ship, sighting a storm on the horizon, should turn all its efforts to throwing overboard the only sailor who knew how to read the sky. The ministry did not merely ignore its wisest voice. It worked with real and patient effort to ensure that no one would listen to it, and in doing so, it disarmed itself on the eve of a war it refused to admit was coming. The old man bore all of this with a calm that must have cost him more than he ever showed, for he did not fight to keep his titles or his standing, and he did not bend his warning to buy back the ministry's favor. He understood something the frightened men around him did not, that honors are small things beside the truth, and that a voice which trims itself to please the powerful is no longer worth hearing. He let them take his offices, let them print their mockery, let the world laugh if the world would laugh, and he went on saying the one thing that mattered, which was that the darkness had returned and must be met. There is a quiet grandeur in that steadiness, in a great man's willingness to be called a fool by lesser men rather than betray what he knew to be true, and it stands as the gentle opposite of everything the ministry had become. There is a quiet warning folded into all of this for any age and any government, which is that the voices most worth heeding are often the very ones a frightened power most wishes to silence. The wise and the honest are inconvenient by their nature, for they speak of hard things that comfortable men would rather not hear, and a leadership grown fond of its own ease will always be tempted to treat their inconvenience as a kind of disloyalty. Yet a nation that punishes its truth-tellers teaches all the rest to hold their tongues, and in the silence that follows, the errors of the powerful go uncorrected and grow. The ministry, in casting down the old man, did not merely lose one wise counselor. It sent a lesson through the whole of the wizarding world, that to speak an unwelcome truth was to invite ruin, and that the safest course was to agree with the comfortable men at the top. And here we arrive at the deepest of the ministry's failings in this whole sad season, deeper even than its cruelty to the boy, for a government may perhaps be forgiven a hard word to a child in a moment of panic, but the deliberate silencing of wisdom is a colder and more deliberate sin. The ministry did not fail merely by being frightened, for fear is human and can be forgiven. It failed by turning that fear into a weapon, by choosing to attack the very people who were trying to save it, by preferring the soft lie that soothed it to the hard truth that might have armed it. In silencing both the honest boy and the wise old man, the government cut away the two voices most likely to have spared it what was coming. And it did so not by accident, but by choice, patiently, over many months, in the full light of day. So let the mind rest gently upon the whole shape of it now, the boy discredited and the sage cast down, the newspaper humming its daily poison, the frightened minister sleeping easier for having silenced the voices that disturbed his peace. Picture the old headmaster walking away from his stripped honors without complaint, carrying his warning still, refusing to the last to trade the truth for the world's approval. There is sorrow in the picture, but there is also a strange and steady comfort, for it reminds us that a voice which will not be bought cannot truly be silenced, only ignored, and that ignorance is a wound the ignorant inflict upon themselves. The ministry had cut away its own wisdom, and the cost of that cutting would come due in its own time. But that reckoning belongs to a later hour of the night. For now, let the sorrow settle softly into stillness and rest, for the telling is slow, and the dark is kind, and there is time enough for all of it before the dawn. There came a season when the ministry decided that a school was not truly a place of learning, but a place that ought to be watched, and so it reached out its soft gray hand and set one of its own inside the ancient walls of Hogwarts. The woman it chose did not arrive with thunder or with the crash of dark magic, for that was never the way of the government she served. She arrived instead with a small, polite cough and a cardigan the color of a faded rose, and with a smile so wide and so fixed that it seemed painted upon her face by someone who had never quite understood what a real smile was meant to mean. Her name was Dolores Umbridge, and she came at first only as a teacher, sent to fill the post that no one else seemed able to keep. And she took her seat at the long staff table as though she had always belonged there. She was a short and rather squat figure, broad in the middle and narrow in her thinking, with wide pale eyes that looked out upon the world as a toad might look out upon a pond it intended to own. She loved the color pink in all its softest shades, and she loved kittens painted onto little decorative plates, and she loved bows and frills and everything that seemed gentle and harmless and dear. Yet, beneath that pillow of sweetness lay a mind as hard and as flat as a stone, and the sweetness was not a contradiction of the hardness, but a cover for it, a warm blanket laid carefully over cold iron, so that the iron would not be seen until it was too late to move away from it. When she rose to speak to the school for the first time, she did not shout, for she never shouted, and she did not threaten, for she never needed to threaten. She spoke in a high and girlish voice, breaking into the middle of the headmaster's welcome, as though the ancient courtesy of the place were a small thing easily set aside. And she offered the students many soft words about progress and preservation, and the careful pruning of anything that had been allowed to grow too wild. The wiser among the teachers understood at once what those gentle words truly carried, for they had learned to read the language of the ministry, and they knew that when a government speaks tenderly of order, it is often preparing to take something precious away. What she truly announced, wrapped inside all that lace, was that the Ministry of Magic had at last decided to interfere within the walls of the one place that had always stood a little apart from it. In her classroom, she taught nothing that could be used, and this was not an accident, but a design. She set the students to reading from a dull and bloodless book, chapter after careful chapter of theory that never once allowed a wand to be lifted or a single spell to be cast. She told them, in her patient and reasonable way, that there was no true danger in the world outside, that the fears they had heard whispered were only the inventions of troubled minds, and that a well-ordered classroom had no need of practice, because there would never be anything to practice against. It was a lie built to serve the minister far away, who wished above all things to believe that the darkness had not returned, and she was there to make certain that the children believed it too, or at the very least that they were left unable to defend themselves against it. Slowly, as the weeks turned and the leaves went from green to gold to brown, her power within the castle began to grow, for the ministry did not send her merely to teach and then leave the rest of the school to its old ways. It passed a decree, and then another, and then a great many more, each one printed and stamped and nailed to the wall where every passing student would see it, and each one handing Dolores Umbridge a little more authority than she had held the day before. In time she was named the High Inquisitor, a title invented for her alone, which gave her the right to inspect every teacher in the building, to sit in the back of every lesson with her clipboard upon her knee, and to judge whether each master and mistress of that ancient craft was fit to remain. Those she disliked she could question, and those she questioned she could dismiss, and there was no one within the walls with the power to tell her no. She watched the teachers as a cat watches birds through a window, patient and unblinking, taking her small, careful notes while the lesson went on around her. She asked her questions in that same sweet voice, and she wrote down the answers, and she smiled, and no one could ever quite say that she had done anything cruel, because the cruelty was never in a single act, but in the slow, gathering weight of all of them together. A teacher who had given decades to the school might feel the ground grow uncertain beneath her feet, might feel the eyes upon her back, might feel the quiet suggestion that her long service now hung upon the goodwill of a stranger from the ministry, who cared nothing for the craft and everything for control. And the students, watching this, learned a lesson far darker than any that stood upon their timetable, for they learned that a place they had thought safe could be entered and reshaped by a government that smiled while it did so. What made her presence so heavy was precisely how ordinary it looked. There were no curses hurled down the corridors, no dark marks burned into the sky, no monstrous shapes lurking in the shadows of the dungeons. There was only a small woman in pink, sipping her tea, tending the little plates upon her wall, speaking always in tones of the gentlest reason. And this was the truest teaching of that whole long season, that tyranny does not always come dressed as a monster with fangs and fire, that sometimes it comes as a polite official with a clipboard and a kindly manner, carrying nothing more frightening than a stack of forms and the full weight of the state behind them. The children of that castle came to understand, without ever being told, that a smile can be a mask, and that a soft voice can carry a hard command, and that the most dangerous power is often the one that insists so sweetly that it means only well. The headmaster himself, wise and ancient as he was, could do little to hold her back, for she had not been sent by chance, but by the deliberate hand of the minister, and to remove her would have meant open war with the government of the whole magical world. So she stayed, and she spread, settling into the old stones like a slow, damp cold that reaches first into the corners and then into the very bones of a house. Room by room and rule by rule, she made the school a smaller and a grayer place. And she did it all while believing, with a terrible and serene certainty, that she was the good and reasonable one, that she was bringing peace and order to a wild and unruly place, that every soft cruelty she performed was truly a kindness the children were too foolish to see. And perhaps that was the most frightening thing of all about Dolores Umbridge and the ministry that had sent her, that she never once doubted herself, and slept each night as soundly as a child, untroubled by any of the small, quiet wounds she left behind her in the waking world. Let that thought rest gently now, for there is more of her story still to come, and we will follow it softly into the dark. Among all the small cruelties that Dolores Umbridge carried into the ancient school, there was one that lay quieter and colder than the rest, hidden away in the privacy of her office, where the walls were hung with little plates of painted kittens and the air was thick with the smell of too much perfume. When a student displeased her, when a child spoke a truth she did not wish to hear, or broke some gentle rule she had only lately invented, she did not send them to be shouted at, and she did not raise a hand against them in the way of the cruel masters of older and rougher times. She invited them instead to come and sit with her in the evening, to take a small chair at a small table, and to write lines, as children have always written lines, over and over, as a punishment so old and so ordinary that no one hearing of it would think to be afraid. Yet the quill she gave them was not an ordinary quill, and this was the heart of the horror hidden inside so plain a thing. It was a slender black instrument, elegant and unremarkable to look upon, and she handed it across the table with the same soft courtesy she showed in everything she did. She told the child there was no need for any ink, and the child, not understanding, set the sharp point to the parchment and began to write the words she had chosen for them. And as the words appeared upon the page in a thin dark red, the very same words carved themselves into the back of the writing hand, cut cleanly into the skin, as though traced by an unseen blade, so that the punishment wrote itself twice, once upon the paper and once upon the living flesh. The ink was the child's own blood, drawn up out of their hand by the enchantment, and every letter they were forced to write cost them a little more of it. The pain of the first line was sharp and startling, and the pain of the second was worse, for it fell upon the raw place the first had already opened, and by the 10th line and the 20th and the 50th, the small wound had become a burning thing that would not close. The words she made them write were always the same for each offense, a short and simple sentence stating that they must not tell lies. And as the hours of the evening wore on, those words rose upon the skin in angry red, sinking deeper with each repetition, until at last, if the punishment went on long enough across enough evenings, they healed into a pale scar that would never fully fade. A child might carry the mark of that quill for the rest of their life, a thin white line spelling out the sentence that a smiling woman had forced them to carve into themselves, a small permanent memory of the ministry's idea of discipline. What made the whole thing so deeply and quietly terrible was the manner in which she did it, for there was never any anger in her, never any heat, never any of the ordinary human loss of control that might at least be understood as passion overcoming reason. She sat across the little table sipping her tea, humming softly to herself, glancing up now and then, with her wide, pale eyes and her painted smile, watching the child bleed with the mild, pleasant interest of a woman watching a kettle come slowly to the boil. She did not seem to hate the students at all, and in some ways this was more frightening than hatred would have been, for hatred at least remembers that its object is a person. She treated their pain as a small necessary tidiness, a stain to be dealt with, a lesson to be gently pressed into them for their own eventual good. And she felt, so far as anyone could tell, no more guilt over it than she felt over dusting her little plates. And the children, for their part, often did not tell. This too was part of the cruelty, woven cleverly into its design. To complain would have meant going to the very authorities who had placed her there, the same ministry whose newspaper was even then painting the children's own account of the world as the ravings of the disturbed. And so the students understood, in the wordless way that the young understand such things, that no one in power would take their side. They pressed their bleeding hands into cups of cool water in the common room late at night. They hid the marks beneath their sleeves. And they carried the secret of that quiet office the way the abused so often carry their secrets, in shame and in silence, and in the terrible belief that they would not be believed. So the woman in pink was able to go on, evening after evening, and the wound she left was not only upon the hand, but upon the trust of the young in the fairness of the world. Here, more than anywhere else in the whole long tale of the ministry, we come to the true and terrible lesson that lies at the heart of it. The darkest wizard the world had known would torture his enemies with a curse that made them scream and writhe upon the floor. And the horror of that was plain and open and easy to name for what it was. But Dolores Umbridge tortured children with a pretty quill and a cup of tea, with a soft voice and a patient smile, and she called it not torture at all, but discipline and order, and the shaping of proper young people into obedient citizens. She wrapped the oldest cruelty in the language of the classroom, and in doing so, she showed that the machinery of a government can commit real and lasting harm while never once raising its voice, never once admitting to itself what it truly is, always insisting that it acts only out of care. And because it came wearing the clothing of an ordinary punishment, a thing every child had known in some milder form, it slipped past every defense that the young might have raised against a plainer sort of monster, entering their trust before they understood that trust was the very thing it meant to take from them. There is a special kind of chill in that thought, the understanding that pain does not always arrive with a snarl and a raised fist, that it can arrive instead with good manners and a gentle explanation, stamped and approved, and entirely within the rules. The blood upon that parchment was drawn under the full authority of the Ministry of Magic. In a school, the ministry had come to govern. By a woman the ministry had chosen and raised up and trusted. And no law within that world rose to stop her, because the law itself had been bent to her side. The quill that wrote in blood was not the work of a rebel or an outlaw hiding in the shadows. It was the quiet work of the state, performed in a comfortable office over cups of tea by someone who slept soundly every single night. And so we lay this heaviest of chapters gently down, not to dwell upon its pain, but to let it settle and soften into the larger stillness of the story. Remember only the shape of its lesson, that the most dangerous cruelty is the kind that has convinced itself it is kindness, the kind that carries a smile and a soft voice and a form to be filled in, the kind that never doubts and never bleeds and never lies awake. The children of that castle would carry their small scars onward into the years that followed, and some of them would grow into the very people who at last stood up against the darkness, their marked hands closing around their wands, their quiet courage forged in part within that perfumed little room. For now, let the memory rest, and let the burning fade to a pale line, and let sleep come softly over all of it as the night deepens around you. If the quill in the quiet office was the sharpest of the cruelties that came into the school, then the decrees upon the walls were the slowest and the widest, spreading outward until they touched every corner of the ancient castle and every hour of every ordinary day. For Dolores Umbridge did not rely upon dark magic to break the spirit of a place, and this was perhaps the most instructive thing about her whole long reign. She relied instead upon paper, upon rules, upon the endless patient multiplication of small regulations, each one printed in fine official lettering, each one stamped with the seal of the ministry, each one nailed carefully to the stone wall of the entrance hall, where the students filed past it every morning on their way to breakfast. And as the number of those signs grew, the castle itself seemed to shrink, its wide old freedoms narrowing 1 gentle inch at a time. Each new decree was announced with a number, as though it were part of some vast and reasonable body of law that had always existed and only now was being written down. The first few seemed almost sensible, or at least small enough that a student might shrug and walk on, for who would go to war over a rule about the placing of a notice or the manner of a greeting? But the numbers climbed, past 20 and past 50, and onward still, and with each one another ordinary piece of daily life was quietly folded up and put away. Clubs were forbidden unless she personally approved them, and she approved almost none, so that the small gatherings where students had for centuries met to share a passion or a game simply ceased to be. Groups of more than a handful of children walking together became a thing to be suspected, and friendships themselves fell under a soft, watchful eye, as though the joining of young hearts were a danger to be managed. There is a particular quiet torment in living beneath a great and ever-growing body of rules, and it is a torment quite different from the sharp pain of a single blow. A blow ends, and the ache of it fades, and the one who was struck at least knows plainly that they have been wronged. But a life hemmed in by endless regulation offers no such clarity, for there is no single moment of injury to point to, only the slow accumulating weight of 100 small constraints, each one too minor on its own to be worth a protest, and all of them together forming a cage. The students of that castle woke each day into a world with a little less air in it than the day before, and they could not always say precisely what had been taken, only that the bright, wide feeling of being young and free had somehow drained away while they were looking elsewhere. This was the deep and subtle lesson that Umbridge and the ministry behind her taught without ever meaning to teach it, that a spirit can be worn down not by cruelty alone, but by rules laid gently upon rules until the weight of them bows the neck. She banned the things that gave the school its warmth, the harmless pleasures, the small rebellions of ordinary joy, the noise and color and disorder that are the natural music of the young. She made joy itself into something faintly suspect, a thing that had to be approved before it could be permitted. And in a place where every laugh might be a small infraction, the laughter grows quiet and careful, and then, at last, mostly stops. The corridors that had once rung with the ordinary happy chaos of children grew hushed and watchful, and the hush was not peace, but fear wearing the clothing of peace. What made it all the more effective was that none of it could easily be resisted, for how does one fight a notice upon a wall? There was no enemy to face, no curse to deflect, no dark shape to stand against with a raised wand. There was only the rule, calm and impersonal, and backed by the full authority of the state, and to break it was to be caught not in a battle, but in a punishment, quietly, in a small office, over a cup of tea. The students learned to police themselves and even one another, to glance at the walls before they spoke, to weigh each small pleasure against the long list of what was now forbidden. And in this way the regulations did their truest work, for the most complete control is the kind that no longer needs a guard, because the guarded have learned to guard themselves. The teachers, for their part, found their own hands bound by the same rising tide of parchment, for the decrees reached them as surely as they reached the students. What they might teach, how they might teach it, whom they might speak to, and what they might say. All of it was slowly gathered under the authority of the woman with the clipboard. And a master of 40 years' standing might find that he could no longer conduct his lessons in the way that 4 decades of wisdom had taught him was best. And when a teacher chafed, there was always the threat of inspection, of the note quietly taken, of the judgment that could end a lifetime of service with a single stroke of the ministry's pen. So even the elders of the castle learned to grow careful, and a carefulness spread through the whole community like a cold mist, dampening the fire that had always been the true warmth of the place. It is worth resting a while upon how strange and how frightening this truly was, that a school could be so nearly broken without a single dark spell being cast within its walls. The ministry did not need to send monsters, and it did not need to send curses, for it had discovered a subtler instrument, the simple, endless production of rules. Bureaucracy, patient and gray and tireless, proved able to accomplish what open force might never have managed, the slow suffocation of a free and joyful place. And it accomplished this while maintaining at every step that it was only bringing order, only ensuring safety, only doing what any reasonable government would do for the good of the children in its care. There was a kind of genius to it, a terrible administrative genius, and it worked precisely because it never looked like violence, and so was never quite resisted as violence. And yet, and this is the gentle turn that keeps the story from despair, the endless rules also carried within them the seeds of their own undoing. For when joy is forbidden, it does not vanish so much as it goes quietly underground. And in the hidden corners of that regulated castle the students began to gather in secret, to teach one another the very things the ministry had forbidden them to learn, to keep alive between them the warmth that the decrees had tried to smother. The very heaviness of the rules made the small acts of freedom beneath them feel precious and brave, and a resistance that no single decree could have provoked grew slowly out of the whole suffocating weight of them together. So, even here, in the grayest chapter of the school's long trial, there was a light that would not be regulated away, waiting patiently in the dark. Let that gentle thought carry you now towards sleep, the knowledge that no wall of rules, however high, can quite enclose the human wish to be free, and that the spirit which seems most nearly broken is often only gathering itself quietly in the shadows, waiting for its hour. The decrees would come down at last, torn from the walls and forgotten, and the castle would breathe again. For now, let the numbers fade, and let the parchment yellow and curl, and let the long list of what was forbidden dissolve softly into the stillness of the night. We leave the school now and return to the great building at the heart of it all, to the Ministry of Magic itself, and we go down beneath its polished surface to look at a thing that had lived there quietly for a very long time. When a witch or a wizard first stepped into the grand atrium of that place, they found themselves in a hall built to impress and to reassure. With a floor of dark gleaming wood, polished until it shone like still water, with a ceiling of deepest peacock blue across which golden symbols moved and shifted, and with a great fountain rising in the center, whose golden figures poured bright water into a wide basin below. Everything about that entrance was designed to say that here was order, here was dignity, here was a government worthy of the trust of a whole hidden world. And yet, as with so much else in this long story, the shining surface was a kind of gentle lie, for beneath the marble ran veins of a quieter corruption that the polish was meant to hide. The corruption of the ministry was rarely the loud and obvious kind that announces itself, the bag of gold pressed openly into a waiting hand. It was softer than that, and slower, and far more respectable, woven so deeply into the ordinary workings of the place that many who took part in it would have been genuinely startled to hear it named as wrong. It was the favor done for an old family friend, the uncomfortable question that somehow never reached the desk where it might have mattered, the investigation that grew mysteriously tired and wandered away from a powerful name before it could arrive at any troubling conclusion. It was the law bending, always so gently that no single bend could be pointed to, always leaning a little in the direction of those who had the gold and the name and the long connections to make the leaning happen. There were families in that world whose wealth was very old and very great, and such families had learned across the generations that the surest shield against the law was not to break it openly, but to befriend the people who administered it. A generous gift to the right cause, a warm word in the ear of the right official, a reputation for helpfulness quietly maintained across many years, and a family might find that the rules which pressed so hard upon ordinary folk somehow pressed only lightly upon them. One such family in particular, pale and proud and immensely rich, moved through the corridors of the ministry as though they owned a share of it, and in a manner of speaking they did, for their gold had bought them a standing that no honest accounting of their deeds could ever have earned. When suspicion fell upon them, as now and then it did, the suspicion had a way of dissolving before it could harden into any charge. This was the quiet betrayal that lay at the center of the whole institution, that a body created to serve everyone equally had slowly learned instead to serve itself and its friends. The ministry was meant to be the one place where the poor and the powerful stood alike before the law, where a wrong done to the least of its citizens would be weighed as heavily as a wrong done to the greatest. But over the long years it had drifted from that purpose, so gradually that few within it noticed the drift, until it had become a place where influence spoke louder than justice, and where the wealthy could purchase not only comfort, but a measure of immunity from the very rules they helped to write. And the terrible thing was how ordinary it all felt from the inside, how reasonable, How much like simply the way that things were done. The cost of this soft corruption fell, as such costs always do, upon those least able to bear it, upon the ordinary and the unconnected and the poor, who had no gold to smooth their path and no ancient name to open the doors that stayed so firmly shut against them. When such a person came before the ministry seeking justice, they came without a shield, and if their case happened to trouble someone powerful, they might find the whole slow weight of the institution turning quietly against them. The favors and the friendships all flowed upward, toward those who already had much, and away from those who had little, so that the machine which called itself the guardian of them all became in truth a guardian chiefly of its own comfort and of the comfort of its wealthy friends. Justice, in that building, had learned to check the name upon the door before it decided how loudly to speak. And this is a thing worth resting upon gently in the quiet of the night. The understanding that an institution can rot without any single villain ever choosing to make it so. No one, perhaps, ever sat down and decided that the ministry should become corrupt. Instead, 1,000 small, ordinary choices, each one easy to excuse, each one made by someone who thought of themselves as decent and reasonable, added slowly one upon another across the years until the whole vast body leaned quietly away from justice. The favor that seemed harmless, the question that seemed not worth pressing, the powerful friend it seemed only sensible not to offend, all of these were small, and all of them together were not small at all, for together they hollowed out the very heart of the thing, and left only the shining marble shell. The deeper danger in all of this was the way that corruption prepared the ground for something far worse than itself. A government that has already learned to bend for gold has learned, without quite realizing it, to bend, and a body that has taught itself to look away from the misdeeds of the powerful has taught itself the habit of looking away. When at last a true darkness came reaching toward the ministry, hoping to seize it from within, it found an institution already softened, already accustomed to serving private interests over public duty, already skilled in the fine art of not asking the uncomfortable question. The corruption beneath the marble did not itself do the great evil that was coming, but it wore away the walls that might have kept that evil out, and a house whose foundations have been quietly eaten from below will fall all the more easily when the storm finally leans against it. So we come to understand that the shining atrium, with its golden fountain and its peacock ceiling and its floor like polished water, was a kind of beautiful mask laid over a face that had grown tired and compromised. The ministry still looked, to the casual visitor, like the very picture of a proud and honest government, and it still believed of itself that it was one. But belief is not the same as truth, and the gleaming surface hid a slow decay that its own officials had ceased even to see, so accustomed had they grown to the way that things were done. The gold spoke, and the law listened, and the ordinary folk of that world went on trusting a guardian that had quietly stopped guarding them. Let this settle now into the wider stillness of the story, not as a thing to trouble your rest, but as one more soft piece of the whole slow picture we have been gently building. The ministry did not fall in a single hour, and it was not brought low by a single hand, but was worn thin across many quiet years by the small, ordinary corruptions of comfortable people, until it stood at last hollow behind its shining marble, ready for the darkness that would soon come, walking through its polished doors. For now, let the fountain run softly, and let the golden figures grow still, and let the whole great tired building fade gently into the deepening quiet of the night, when at last the denials of Cornelius Fudge could no longer hold against the plain weight of the truth, when the return of the darkest wizard had been seen in the very heart of the ministry itself, and could not be argued away. The office of minister passed into the hands of a man named Rufus Scrimger, and it is worth resting a while upon what kind of leader he was. For he was neither wicked nor foolish, and yet his story tells us something quiet and sad about power all the same. Scrimger had come up through the Auror office, the branch of the ministry that trained the hunters of dark wizards, and he carried himself always with the manner of a soldier, a lean and tawny figure with a mane of grizzled hair and keen eyes behind spectacles, walking with a slight limp that made him seem, to those who watched him, like an old lion still circling his territory. Where Fudge had wished above all to be comfortable, Scrimger wished above all to appear strong. And though these two wishes seem very different, they grew in the end from the same soil. For both men were more concerned with how the government looked to the frightened public than with whether the government was truly doing the deep and difficult work of protecting anyone at all. Scrimger took his seat in a season of real fear, when the darkness that Fudge had ignored for a full year was now spreading unchecked across the country, when bridges fell and families vanished, and a soft gray terror settled over the wizarding world like fog upon still water. The people wanted to be told that someone was in charge, that a firm hand had taken the wheel, and Scrimger understood this hunger perfectly and set about feeding it, not with the slow and honest labor of true security, but with the appearance of security, which is a far cheaper thing to produce and a far more dangerous thing to sell. He wanted the wizarding world to feel that the ministry was winning, and so he arranged the machinery of the state to manufacture that feeling. And here we come to one of the quieter cruelties in the long tale of the ministry, a cruelty committed not out of malice, but out of the simple wish to seem competent. For Scrimger, needing to show the public that arrests were being made and that the enemy was being caught, began to fill the cold cells of Azkaban with suspects. And among those suspects were people whose only crime was to be convenient. A young man named Stan Shunpike, who had done nothing worse in his life than call out the stops upon a wizarding bus, was taken into custody upon the flimsiest of suspicions and locked away in that terrible fortress, so that the newspapers might print that the ministry had made an arrest, and so that the frightened readers might sleep a little easier, believing that the guilty were being gathered up. It did not matter greatly to the men at the top whether the particular person in the cell had truly done anything, for the purpose of the arrest was not justice, but reassurance, and reassurance requires only a name and a locked door, not the patient discovery of truth. In this we see the old pattern of the ministry returning yet again, the same pattern that had swallowed Sirius Black years before, the willingness to sacrifice the innocent upon the altar of appearances, to trade a person's freedom for the public's comfort, as though the two things could ever be weighed upon the same honest scale. Scrimger also turned his attention to a boy, as the ministry had a habit of doing, though this time the aim was not to discredit the boy, but to use him. For Harry Potter had by now become a figure of enormous meaning in the minds of ordinary witches and wizards, a symbol of hope in a dark time, the one the Whispers called the Chosen One. And Scrimger saw in that symbol a tool he might hold up before the public to make the ministry itself appear blessed and favored and strong. He came to Harry and asked him, in gentle and reasonable words, to be seen coming and going from the ministry, to let it be known that the famous boy and the government stood together, so that the people might believe that the boy's hope and the ministry's power were one and the same thing. It was a request dressed in the language of the common good, and Scrimger surely told himself that it served everyone. And yet, beneath the fine wrapping it was a hollow thing, for it asked the boy to lend his true courage to a false image, to place his honest name upon a comfort the ministry had not earned. And the boy refused, quietly and firmly, because he had learned already, in the hardest of ways, what the ministry was capable of. how it had denied the truth and slandered the innocent, and sent its smiling inspector into his school, and he would not now become a bright ornament upon the front of an institution he could not trust. The refusal wounded Scrimgeour, who could not understand why anyone would decline to stand beside power, and the two of them parted with a coldness between them, the old lion baffled that the young one would not be led. Yet it must be said, for fairness is the gentle thread that runs through all of this telling, that Scrimgeour was not a small man in the way that Fudge had been small, and his story does not end in the cheapness of his methods. For when the darkness finally came for Rufus Scrimgeour himself, when the servants of the Dark Wizard broke at last into the ministry to seize the whole government by force, they came to him, and they demanded that he tell them where Harry Potter was hidden, and where the members of the secret order that opposed them could be found. And here, at the very end of his life, the man who had cared so much for the appearance of strength discovered within himself a strength that was entirely real. For he refused to answer. He refused to betray the boy who had refused him. He refused to hand over the location of those who fought the darkness, even though the price of his silence was his own death. He was tortured and he was killed, and he died holding one small, honest secret behind his teeth, giving nothing to the enemy. And in that final refusal, he redeemed a great deal of what had gone before, showing that even a man too fond of appearances may, when everything else is stripped away, be found to have a true thing at his core. So we should hold Rufus Scrimgeour gently in our thoughts as we let this chapter settle, remembering that he was a mixture, as most who hold power are a mixture, capable of the shabby injustice of filling a prison with innocence to look decisive, and capable also of a quiet and unbought courage at the moment when it mattered most. His life is a lesson in how a government can mistake the face of strength for the substance of it, can polish its image while the true rot spreads beneath. And yet, it is also a small and warming reminder that even within so flawed an institution, there could still be found a single man who, at the last, would not sell what was right for any price at all. And with that thought, that even in the coldest corridors a spark of honor could survive, we may let our breathing slow and let the tawny lion of the ministry lie down at last in the long grass of the story, his watch ended, his one true secret kept, and the tale moving softly onward toward the deeper dark that was even then gathering at the doors. Now we come to the strangest and quietest catastrophe in the whole long life of the Ministry of Magic. The moment when it fell, and it is a thing worth dwelling upon slowly, for the ministry did not fall in the way that great things are imagined to fall, with fire and thunder and the ringing of alarms across the marble. It did not fall in open battle, with armies meeting in the atrium and the fountains shattering and the walls coming down. For such a fall, however terrible, would at least have been visible, would at least have been a thing that everyone could see and name and mourn. Instead, the ministry was taken so gently, so smoothly, so quietly from within, that a great many of the witches and wizards who worked in its endless corridors did not even understand for some time that anything at all had changed. And they went on stamping their forms and folding their memos into little paper birds, and riding the golden lifts up and down the polished shafts, as though the world were exactly as it had always been. The darkest wizard had learned, across the long years of his patience, a lesson that the loud and the cruel so often fail to learn, that the surest way to seize a thing is not to smash it, but to slip inside it and turn it slowly to your purpose while it still believes itself to be whole. And the ministry, as we have watched throughout this telling, had made itself into the perfect vessel for exactly such a taking, for it was an institution built upon obedience, upon the following of orders, upon the deep and unquestioned habit of doing what the person above you in the corridor instructed you to do. A government that has taught its people, year upon year, to obey without asking why, to trust the stamp and the signature and the official memo, to assume that whatever comes down from the office above must be correct and lawful and good, has already done most of the tyrant's work for him. For it has built a machine that will run in any direction the hand at the top chooses to steer it, and it will run just as smoothly toward cruelty as it once ran toward order. The Dark Wizard did not need to conquer the ministry then, so much as to place his own people quietly within it, one here and one there, in the offices that mattered, in the departments that made the decisions and signed the papers and commanded the enforcers. His servants moved into positions of trust like water seeping into the cracks of a stone, and because they wore the same robes and carried the same credentials and spoke the same careful language of procedure, no alarm was raised, no line was crossed that anyone could point to, no single dreadful moment arrived at which a brave clerk might have stood up and cried out that the enemy was inside the walls. It happened, instead, in 1,000 small and unremarkable steps, a transfer here, an appointment there, a quiet retirement encouraged, a troublesome official replaced, until one gray morning the whole structure belonged to the darkness, and hardly anyone had seen the moment when it changed hands. And because each of those steps was small, and because each of them wore the ordinary and dusty clothing of routine, there was never a moment at which the honest people within the building could gather their courage and say that here, at last, was the line that must not be crossed. For no such single line was ever drawn, and the crossing was accomplished in so many tiny and separate movements that it was already finished before it could be seen at all. At the very heart of this quiet capture stood the new Minister for Magic, a man named Pious Thickness, who sat in the highest office of the wizarding government and gave the orders and signed the decrees and was, to all appearances, the lawful head of the state. And yet Pious Thickness was not truly there at all, for his mind had been taken from him by one of the darkest of the forbidden curses, the curse that steals a person's will and leaves the body walking and speaking and signing while another hand entirely guides it from the shadows. Thickness looked out through his own eyes and moved his own lips, but the choices were not his, the words were not his. The will behind the pen was the will of the enemy, and so the highest seat in the ministry became a hollow mask, a face of authority worn over an emptiness, a puppet seated upon the throne of a nation, while the true master remained unseen and unnamed, and content to let the machine believe it still governed itself. And here is the deep and quiet horror of it, the thing worth turning over softly in the dim as sleep draws near, that the takeover worked precisely because it left the outward form of the ministry untouched. The letters still went out upon the same official parchment, sealed with the same official seals. The departments still met and deliberated and issued their decisions. The enforcers of the law still answered when they were called, still obeyed the memos that came down from above, still trusted that an order signed by the minister was an order that ought to be carried out. Nothing looked broken, and so nothing rang the bell of alarm in the minds of the ordinary and decent workers who filled the building, and many of them carried on for days and weeks, doing their small and dutiful tasks in the service of a government that had already been hollowed out and turned against everything it was meant to protect. The very virtues on which the ministry had always prided itself, its order, its regularity, its smooth and reliable procedure, became now the instruments of its capture. For a machine that runs perfectly will run just as perfectly for a monster as for a friend. Consider what this tells us, gently, without alarm, as one considers a hard truth from a safe and warm distance. The tyrant did not need to invent a single new power to rule the wizarding world, for the ministry had already gathered into its hands every power he could wish for. It had the prison in the cold northern sea, already built, already staffed with the creatures of despair. It had the enforcers, already trained to obey. It had the newspaper and the presses, already accustomed to printing whatever the government wished the people to believe. It had the endless apparatus of stamps and forms and registrations and decrees, all of it lying ready, all of it waiting only for a hand to pick it up. The dark wizard walked into a house that had been furnished over long years, with every tool a tyrant could ever want, and all he had to do was quietly change the locks and settle into the master's chair while the household went on with its chores, never guessing that the kind and lawful government it served had, without a single window breaking, become the servant of the very thing it had always claimed to guard against. So the ministry fell, and the falling was silent, and the silence is the lesson. It is easy to fear the loud evil, the wizard with the wand raised, and the terrible face, for such evil announces itself, and we know at once to run or to stand. It is far harder to fear the quiet evil that comes wearing the familiar robes and carrying the familiar papers, that asks only for the obedience we have already been trained to give, that changes nothing we can see until everything we cannot see has already been lost. And with that soft and heavy thought, we may let the corridors of the ministry grow dim in our minds, the golden lifts still rising and falling in the dark, the paper birds still fluttering down the halls, the whole vast machine humming quietly onward in the hands of its new and hidden master, while we, safe and far away and warm, let our own thoughts slow, and let the weight of the day settle, and drift gently toward the deeper stillness that waits just beyond the edge of this long and quiet tale. Now that the ministry had been taken quietly from within, now that its highest seat was filled by a hollow man whose will belong to the darkness, the great machine turned at last to the purpose for which the tyrant had always meant to use it, and it turned that purpose against the most defenseless people in the whole of the wizarding world. The witches and wizards who had been born to families with no magic in them, the ones whom the cruel had long called by an ugly name, and whom the kind had simply called their friends. And there is something especially chilling to rest upon here in the quiet, something worth turning over slowly as the night deepens, that this persecution did not arrive with dark wands and masked faces in the manner one might expect from open evil, but arrived instead upon official parchment, stamped and sealed and filed, wearing all the calm and orderly costume of the law. For the ministry, wearing now the mask of legitimate government, created a new office to carry out its cruelty, an office given a bland and reasonable name so that it might sound like any other department of a proper state. And this office set itself to a single grim task, the hunting down of every witch and wizard born of families without magic. The reasoning it offered was a monstrous falsehood dressed as scholarship, the claim that magic could only be truly inherited by blood, that those born to families without it must therefore have stolen it somehow, must have taken by theft or trickery a power that was not rightfully theirs. It was a lie with no truth in it anywhere, for magic had always appeared where it wished, blooming in the children of ordinary families as freely as spring flowers appear in a field that no one has sown. And every honest witch and wizard knew this in their hearts. Yet the lie did not need to be true. It needed only to be official, printed and stamped and given the weight of the state. For once a falsehood is written upon government parchment and pressed with a government seal, a great many people will treat it as though it were a fact. And this is one of the oldest and saddest of the powers that any government holds. And so the ones who had been born to families without magic were summoned, one by one, their names drawn from the very registries that the ministry had kept for so long in its endless love of records and lists. Those harmless-seeming ledgers of births and schoolings that had been gathered over the years for reasons that had once seemed dull and administrative and safe. Here, we see the quiet danger of a government that keeps everything written down, that files and catalogs and registers every soul within its reach. For a list made in a time of peace becomes, in a time of tyranny, a map that leads the hunters straight to their prey. The paper birds that had once fluttered so innocently down the corridors, carrying memos about broom regulations and cauldron thicknesses, now carried summonses that stole people from their homes, and the stamps that had once seemed the very picture of dull and harmless order now pressed their seals upon the ruin of ordinary lives. Those who were summoned were brought before tribunals, gatherings dressed in all the solemn furniture of justice, with seats raised high and cold, and a great chamber, and the appearance of law. And yet these were not truly courts at all, for a true court seeks the truth and weighs it fairly. And these gatherings had already decided their answer before ever the accused was brought in. The witches and wizards who stood before them were asked to prove a thing that could not be proven, to show a magical bloodline they had never possessed and could not possibly produce. And when they could not produce it, as of course they could not, they were treated as thieves and impostors, their wands taken from them, which for a witch or wizard is a wounding almost beyond describing. For the wand is a companion and an extension of the self, and to have it snapped or seized is to be cut off from a part of one's own being. And beyond the taking of the wands lay worse things still: imprisonment in the cold fortress in the northern sea, and the presence of the creatures of despair, and a darkness closing over people whose only crime was to have been born. Presiding over a great part of this cruelty, wearing still her soft pink and her sweet and girlish smile, was the same woman who had once come to the school as an inspector and had carved her cruelties into the hands of children with a quill that wrote in blood. She had risen, as such people so often rise in a frightened and obedient government, and she sat now in judgment over the accused. And she did her terrible work with the same dreadful calm she had always shown, the same patience, the same quiet satisfaction, the same absolute certainty that she was simply upholding the rules and keeping good order. And this is perhaps the most instructive thing of all to rest upon, that the cruelty of the ministry in its darkest hour did not need snarling villains or wild-eyed fanatics, but was carried out in large part by tidy people who loved procedure, who filled in their forms correctly and filed them in the proper place, and went home at the end of the day believing themselves to be respectable servants of the law. And now, having watched all of this, having followed the long path from the very first chapter of this telling to this cold place where the ministry hunts the innocent with stamps and seals, we come round again to the question that stood at the very beginning of our journey. The question that gave this whole quiet tale its name: whether the Ministry of Magic was truly the real villain after all. And the answer, spoken softly here in the dim, is a gentle and careful one, neither a simple yes nor a simple no. For the ministry was not evil in the way that the darkest wizard was evil. It did not set out from the beginning to torment and to kill. It was not born wicked. And most of the ordinary people who filled its corridors across the years were not monsters, but only clerks and enforcers and inspectors doing what they were told. And yet, and this is the heart of the whole matter, the ministry was the door through which the true evil walked. And it was a door the ministry itself had built and oiled and left unguarded, hinge by hinge, across all the long years of its denial and its pride and its cruelty and its comfortable looking away. Every failing we have wandered through in this telling became, in the end, a gift to the tyrant. The prison already built and staffed with despair the enforcers already trained to obey without asking, the newspaper already accustomed to printing whatever power wished, the endless registries already listing every soul, the deep habit already planted in every heart of trusting the stamp and following the memo and assuming that what came from above was lawful and good. The ministry did not need to become the darkness in order to serve it. It needed only to be exactly what it had always been, a great and obedient machine that would run in whatever direction its master chose. And so the very ordinariness of its faults, the very smallness and dullness of its everyday failings, was precisely what made it so perfect an instrument in the hands of the worst wizard who ever lived. And with that quiet and weighty understanding settling gently over us, like a blanket drawn up in the dark, we may let the cold tribunals fade from our minds, and let the stolen wands and the frightened faces soften into the mist of a story that is nearly told, and turn at last toward the calm and closing stillness that waits just ahead. And so we come, softly and without haste, to the closing of this long and quiet tale, and there is no need now for any new alarm or any fresh sorrow. For the work of understanding is done, and all that remains is to let the pieces settle gently into their places, the way that leaves settle upon still water at the end of a windless day. We have wandered together through the whole long life of the Ministry of Magic, from its founding as a machine meant to keep the secret of magic safe, down through its corridors of dark polished wood, past its enchanted memos and its golden lifts, out to the cold fortress in the northern sea, and back again to the marble atrium where the fountains once played. And we have seen it in all its greatness and in all its smallness. And perhaps the kindest thing we can do at the end is simply to hold the whole of it in our minds at once, gently, without anger, the way one holds the memory of a person who did both harm and good. For that is what the ministry was. In the end, not a monster and not a savior, but a mixture. A vast and human thing, full of the ordinary faults that live in all large and powerful institutions. And the deepest lesson of its story is perhaps the quietest one, that great harm need not come from great wickedness, that it can grow instead from small and everyday failings allowed to gather and to harden over many years. We saw the denial of a frightened minister who preferred the comfort of looking away to the hard labor of facing what was true. We saw the pride that could not bear a rival and so silenced the wisest voice it had. We saw the cruelty that wore a soft pink smile and called itself discipline and order. We saw the corruption that let gold speak louder than justice beneath the polished floors. We saw a man sent to a cold prison for 12 years without a trial, forgotten by a government too certain of itself to wonder whether it had erred. And we saw, at the last, how all of these small and separate failings joined together into a single open door through which the true darkness walked without ever having to force the lock. And yet, even as we hold these wrongs, let us not forget that the same story held moments of quiet light, and it is right to let those moments warm us now as the tale draws to its close. For there was the man who cared too much for the appearance of strength, and yet, at the very end, found within himself a strength that was entirely real, refusing to betray the ones he might have betrayed, keeping his one honest secret behind his teeth, even unto death. There were the ordinary clerks and enforcers who, when they finally understood what the machine had become, chose quietly to resist it, to warn the hunted, to look away at the right moment instead of the wrong one, to be decent in small and unrecorded ways that no history would ever name. There was, running underneath all the cold procedure, a deep and stubborn goodness in a great many ordinary hearts, and though it did not prevent the fall, it was never entirely extinguished, and in the fullness of time it would help to set things right again. For no darkness, however smooth and however patient, holds forever against the slow and gentle persistence of what is good. So the great question that gave this telling its name may be laid down now, softly and left to rest. Was the ministry the real villain after all? The gentle answer, the true answer, is that it was not the villain in the way the darkest wizard was the villain, for it did not desire the world's suffering and did not delight in cruelty for its own sake. And yet neither was it innocent, for its denial and its pride and its comfortable cowardice and its love of order over justice were the very things that opened every door the true villain walked through. It was not the fire, but it was the dry and waiting wood. It was not the flood, but it was the low and unguarded place where the water gathered. And the wisdom we may carry away from all of this, carry away gently and without heaviness, is simply that the institutions meant to protect us must be watched with a patient and loving care, must be reminded again and again to face the truth even when the truth is frightening, to hear the voices they would rather silence, to guard the innocent even when guarding them is inconvenient. For it is precisely when a good thing grows proud and comfortable and unwilling to look at itself that it becomes most easily turned to harm. But let all of that grow soft and distant now, for the telling is truly done, and there is nothing left for you to hold or to solve or to carry. Let the corridors of the ministry fade into a warm and harmless dimness in your mind. The golden lifts slowing and coming at last to rest, the paper birds folding their wings and settling silently upon the empty desks, the fountains growing still, the great marble hall quiet and calm and empty in the soft gray light. Let the cold fortress in the northern sea recede until it is only a small and faraway shape upon the horizon of a story you no longer need to enter. Let the frightened faces and the stolen wands and the tidy cruelties all soften and blur and drift away like mist lifting from a valley at the first touch of a gentle morning that has not yet come. There is nothing here to fear, for all of this happened long ago and far away, in a tale that has now been told to its very end, and you are safe and warm and still, and the only thing left to do is to rest. Think, if you wish, one last soft thought upon how much of this long story turned upon the simple failure to look honestly and kindly and without pride at what a great power was doing in the name of the people it claimed to serve, and let even that thought grow gentle and warm. For it is not a burden, but a small and quiet gift, a reminder to carry lightly into your waking days. That care and honesty and the courage to face what is true are the soft and steady guardians of everything worth keeping. And now let even that gift set itself down beside you, needing nothing, asking nothing, and let your breathing grow slow and even and untroubled, the way the sea grows calm when the wind lies down, and let the small weight of the day loosen its hold upon you, one gentle thread at a time, until there is nothing left to carry and nowhere left to be but here, in this quiet and this warmth and this stillness. The old wrongs have been named and understood, and in the naming they have lost their sharpness, and now they may settle down into the deep still water of things that are finished, where they can no longer trouble the surface of your rest. There is no more to watch for, and no more to guard against, no memo to answer, and no door to keep. Only the soft dark and the slow breath, and the gentle drifting down into the deeper quiet that has been waiting patiently for you all along. Let it come as slowly as it likes, and let yourself go toward it just as slowly, with no effort and no hurry, for the tale is done, and the world is quiet, and all is well, and you may rest now, and rest, and rest. And so the long telling comes gently to its close, We have wandered together through the marble halls of the Ministry of Magic, past its endless departments and its folded paper birds, out to the cold sea where Azkaban stands and the Dementors keep their silent watch. We have remembered the man imprisoned without a trial, the father who was too hard, the minister who chose not to see, and the woman whose cruelty wore a soft and smiling face. We have watched a great institution silence the wise, discredit the honest, and at last fall quietly into the hands of the very darkness it was built to hold back. The gentle answer we found was that the ministry was not evil in the way the darkest wizard was evil, and yet its pride and its fear opened every door he walked through. There is nothing left now that you must remember, nothing to carry, nothing to hold. Let each of these old wrongs settle softly into the stillness of the past, where they can rest and trouble you no more. Your breathing is slow, your body is heavy and warm, and the world has grown quiet and dim around you. Let it all fade. Sleep now, deeply and well. Good night. And whenever you wish to drift away again, another gentle story will be waiting here for you.